Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A group of friends and I decided to spend the day at the lake, looking forward to some sun, swimming, and grilling burgers. We had rented a small cabin by the water, tucked away from the main shore, surrounded by tall trees. The plan was to relax and enjoy the quiet, but things quickly went south. We arrived early in the morning, and the place was exactly as we'd pictured: peaceful, remote, far from the noise of civilization. We set up camp near the lake, took out the boats, and spent the first half of the day swimming and joking around. The water was cool and refreshing, and we all felt content. Around midday, we decided to take a hike along the trail that followed the shoreline. The trees stretched high above us, casting long shadows over the dirt path. We walked for about an hour, laughing and pointing out strange-looking rocks or trees that had been twisted by the wind. It was nice, peaceful even. That's when it happened. We came across an old, weathered sign that pointed off the trail. "No trespassing," it read. We hesitated for a moment, unsure if we should follow it. Curiosity got the better of us, and one of us, the bravest, or perhaps the most reckless, led the way. The trail disappeared into thick undergrowth. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was eerily quiet now, with only the faint rustling of leaves as the wind shifted. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on us. Suddenly, we stopped. The trail ended abruptly in front of us, but it wasn't just a dead end. It was as if something had been cleared away, as though we weren't meant to go any further. The ground was packed hard, with claw marks etched into the earth as if something had been dragged through there. My stomach twisted at the sight. We turned back, uneasy now. As we retraced our steps, we realized the forest felt wrong. The air was thick, colder somehow, and the silence was oppressive. I could hear my friends breathing, each breath sharp and shallow. The usual sounds of birds and insects had vanished. When we made it back to the lake, the cabin was still in sight, but something had changed. The sunlight seemed dimmer, the air colder. It wasn't until we were nearly back that we noticed it. Someone had followed us. At first, I thought it was just one of our own shadows. But when I turned to glance behind us, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, far away but clear enough to make out. It wasn't moving, just watching. We didn't speak. We just bolted toward the cabin, leaving the figure behind. Inside, we locked all the doors and windows, hearts racing. We tried to convince ourselves it was just someone from a neighboring cabin, maybe a hiker who had wandered off trail. But deep down, we knew better. The figure had been watching us, waiting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of silence and paranoia. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made us jump. We knew whatever had followed us was still out there, waiting in the dark. By morning, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. Whatever had followed us wasn't human, or at least not anymore. It started on a normal afternoon, a day like any other. I had taken my son to the old park, the one we used to go to when he was younger. The park had always been a peaceful escape from the city, full of tall trees and winding paths that led nowhere in particular. Today, though, something felt off. We had the whole place to ourselves, which wasn't unusual. It was a weekday, and most people didn't visit parks during these hours. I let my son run ahead, chasing after a frisbee he'd thrown. I stood at the edge of a small pond watching him play. The water rippled under the weight of the afternoon sun, and the sound of the birds was soothing. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, expecting to see another parent or maybe a jogger, but there was no one. Just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Must be my imagination, I muttered to myself. But as I turned back to the pond, the footsteps came again. This time, closer. My son didn't seem to notice, still lost in his game. I told myself I was just on edge. The woods could make noises feel louder than they were, right? But the footsteps weren't fading. They were steady, relentless. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had wandered into the park, someone harmless. Still, my heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, trying to find the source of the sound, but saw no one. The footsteps came again, closer this time, circling around the pond. My son, still unaware, continued chasing the frisbee, laughing as he ran. "Stop playing," I shouted, my voice trembling now. "We're leaving." He didn't hear me. Or maybe he didn't care. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure, but my legs felt like they wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave him. Then, as I stepped toward the pond, I saw something. Something in the water. It wasn't a reflection. It was a figure. A shadow, floating just beneath the surface. It wasn't moving like anything natural. It seemed to be watching us. Unmoving. Unmoving. I took a step back from the water, my breath hitching in my throat. What was it? Some kind of trick of the light? My mind raced, but fear took over. I had to get my son. "Come on," I called again, louder this time, my voice breaking. My son didn't seem to hear me. He was too far gone in his play, oblivious to the danger I now felt closing in. I sprinted toward him, my heart screaming with every step. I grabbed his arm, pulling him hard. His laughter stopped, replaced by confusion. "What's wrong, Dad?" "We're leaving." "Now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. As I turned back toward the path, I saw it again. The figure, this time fully visible. It stood at the edge of the pond, watching us. Not human, not animal. Something else entirely. Its form was blurred, not entirely solid, but its eyes were unmistakable. Dark, hollow, watching us. I held my son tighter, running, my breath ragged. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far away from that place. As we reached the park entrance, I glanced once more over my shoulder. The figure was still there, motionless, watching us. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat, racing through my ears. We never went back to that park, and I never looked into water the same way again. I never expected a simple drive through the mountains to turn into something so terrifying. It was one of those quiet Sunday afternoons where the world seemed to move at a slower pace. My friends and I decided to take a scenic route, winding through the hills and valleys, chasing nothing more than the idea of adventure. We left the main road behind, following a narrow, winding path that cut through the trees. The road was so remote, I didn't see another car for miles. It felt peaceful, serene even. The sun filtering through the trees, casting long shadows over the dirt road. We stopped by a bend in the road, wanting to stretch our legs and take in the view. The mountains stretched out in front of us, their jagged peaks rising high into the clouds. There wasn't a soul around, just us and the endless expanse of forest. We leaned against the hood of the car, talking softly, enjoying the stillness. It was then, as we stood there, that we noticed something strange. Out in the distance, near the edge of the woods, a figure stood perfectly still. It wasn't moving. At first, I thought it was a tree, or some kind of rock formation, but the more I looked, the more I could tell it was a person, or at least something that looked human. It wasn't moving, and yet I could feel its eyes on us. We stood frozen, unable to look away. The figure was far enough away that I couldn't make out any features, but something about it felt off. It wasn't just the stillness. It was the way it seemed to blend into the shadows, as if it wasn't entirely part of the world. I suggested we keep walking, hoping it would move away, but none of us wanted to turn our backs on it. The figure remained there, unmoving, just staring. The silence grew heavier. the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Then, from the trees behind us, came a faint whisper. So faint we weren't sure if we'd heard it at all. I turned to my friends, but none of them had said a word. The whisper came again, this time louder and closer. It sounded like it was calling us, but not with a voice. More like a sound you feel in your bones. A noise that didn't belong to the world as we knew it. Panic set in. We couldn't stay. The figure in the distance wasn't moving, but I could feel its presence drawing closer. I grabbed my friends and we ran back to the car. As we tore down the winding road, glancing nervously over our shoulders, the feeling of being followed intensified. Every turn of the road seemed to stretch out in front of us forever, the trees becoming more claustrophobic with each passing second. It felt like we were racing away from something invisible, something that didn't want us to escape. My heart pounded in my chest, my vision blurring with each frantic glance behind. We didn't stop until we hit the main road, where the sight of passing cars reassured us that we had put some distance between us and whatever we had seen. But the road stretched on forever, and that strange figure was always there in my mind, watching. To this day, I don't know what we saw. Was it something real, or was it a trick of the shadows? The figure never moved, never chased us. But I knew, deep down, it was following us in ways we couldn't understand. We made it home safely, but that feeling never left me. Whatever we encountered is still out there, waiting in the quiet places where no one dares to go. It was just a normal Sunday afternoon, and I had decided to take a long drive out to the outskirts of town. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you want to get away from the noise of the city. I hadn't been out this way before, but something about the empty roads and open fields had always called to me. I drove down winding country roads, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled fresh, and for once there was no one around. I appreciated the peace, letting my mind wander. As I drove, I noticed an old barn sitting off in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weathered wooden structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, but something about it tugged at me. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. So I decided to take a detour, leaving the main road behind. When I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath. I approached the barn cautiously. The wood creaked beneath my feet as I made my way closer. The door hung open slightly, swinging faintly in the breeze. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint slivers of sunlight that managed to filter through cracks in the old wood. The place smelled like damp hay and decay. My footsteps echoed, the sound amplified in the stillness. The barn wasn't empty. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, stood something tall and thin. I wasn't sure what it was. At first, I thought it was just old farm equipment or debris. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely unfamiliar. Its form was elongated, with arms that seemed too long, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was hollow and void, no features to speak of, just a black void where the eyes should have been. It stood completely still, like a statue, as if waiting. My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. It felt like the barn had shifted, trapping me in a place with some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the way we think of it. It was more of a whispering thought that seemed to echo inside my own head. "Why are you here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The barn door creaked louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The oppressive silence returned, but now there was something else. Something watching. The figure in the corner shifted just slightly as if it had taken a step toward me. My legs finally moved, carrying me in a frantic stumble toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back, catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure now. There were more, a dozen, maybe more, standing motionless in the dark corners of the barn, all watching me with those empty voids for eyes. I couldn't escape them. The door wouldn't open. I turned back, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The barn felt like it was closing in, folding around me. Then I saw it, the face of one of them. So close now. It was right in front of me, and still it didn't have eyes, just a featureless black void. And yet, I felt it staring deep into me, past my skin and into my soul. The whisper came again. Louder now. Why are you here? This time, I heard my own voice answer, trembling and weak. I don't know, but I did know. I knew something had been waiting for me. It wanted something I couldn't understand. In that moment, I realized that leaving the barn wasn't an option, and neither was forgetting. It started with the sound of dripping water. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone like any other night. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I live alone, so when I first heard it, I thought maybe it was the refrigerator or the old pipes settling. I got up and checked the kitchen, but the dripping didn't seem to be coming from there. I stood still, listening, and it was coming from upstairs. I didn't think much of it at first. Old houses settle, right? Water can be unpredictable. But the sound persisted, steady and rhythmic. A slow, steady drip that seemed to echo throughout the empty house. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps quiet on the carpet, and checked the bathroom. No leaks. The sound was faint but clear now, coming from the end of the hallway. I stood there, staring down the dark corridor, wondering if maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it wasn't in my head. It was too consistent, too real. I slowly pushed open the door to the guest room at the end of the hall. That was where the sound was loudest. The room was dark, dusty, and untouched. I flicked on the light switch and the faint glow illuminated the space. The room had been unused for years. An old dresser, a dusty bed frame, and a broken lamp in the corner. Nothing had changed. I listened again. The dripping was definitely coming from inside the room, but this time it wasn't coming from a pipe. It was coming from the closet. I took a deep breath, my pulse quickening, and slowly made my way toward it. The sound of my own breathing seemed louder than the drip, drip, drip. My hand hesitated on the closet door, and then I pulled it open. The inside was dark and empty, except for something unexpected, a single wet patch on the floor. A puddle, but not a puddle of water. It shimmered in the dim light, almost like it wasn't water at all. I knelt down, my heart racing, and touched it. My fingers sank into the substance. It was cold, sticky, and unidentifiable. I pulled my hand away, wiping it on my jeans, and stared into the closet. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse at first. A shape, a figure standing at the back of the closet, facing away from me. It didn't move, didn't react. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of a figure distorted and shifting in the dim light. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stared, unable to look away. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. The silence stretched on, and then, slowly, the figure turned toward me. Its face wasn't human. No eyes, no features, just void. A hollow, dark space where a face should have been. I could feel its gaze on me, and that's when I realized it wasn't there for water or pipes or anything rational. It had been there for me. I forced myself to turn and stumble out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The dripping sound still echoed through my house, but this time it felt like it was coming from inside me. I still live in that house. The dripping never stopped. I've learned to ignore it, but sometimes, when the house grows too quiet, I swear I can hear the faint sound of footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. I had always loved taking long drives. There was something peaceful about winding roads and open landscapes, a way to clear my head and escape from the chaos of everyday life. One evening, after a particularly long and stressful week, I decided to take a spontaneous trip out into the countryside. The sun was setting as I pulled onto a narrow, winding road surrounded by forests on either side. The world felt silent, distant, almost untouched by time. I had no destination in mind, just the freedom of the open road. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew darker, stretching long and menacing across the pavement. It was almost as if the forest itself was watching. I had the strange feeling that I was being pulled further into some unseen force. I passed a few old, crumbling signs for landmarks that no longer existed. The further I went, the less familiar everything became. The road twisted and turned, the forest thickening around me, swallowing any sense of direction or familiarity. That's when I saw her. At least, I think it was her. A figure standing motionless by the side of the road. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress, her dark hair hanging over her shoulders. Her eyes were hollow, empty, as she stared straight ahead, not moving. I slowed down as I approached, unable to look away. My heart pounded as I passed by her, but something felt off. I glanced back in my rear-view mirror. She wasn't there anymore. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, empty and desolate. I shook my head, trying to brush off the lingering feeling of unease. Maybe I was imagining things, but something about that figure felt wrong. As I continued driving, I came to a sudden realization. I had no idea where I was. The road had changed. It wasn't just winding anymore. It felt like I was on a loop, repeating the same stretch of forest over and over. My panic grew as I pressed harder on the accelerator, hoping to break free from this endless cycle of trees. Then I noticed something strange. Lights. Not from my car, but from deep within the forest. Flickering, distant, like someone was trying to signal to me. I couldn't stop myself. I followed the faint glow deeper into the woods. The light grew brighter, and soon I could see a figure moving towards me. It wasn't the woman from before. This figure was taller, obscured by the thick shadows, but its eyes seemed to shine like dark pools. The closer I got, the harder it was to focus. The light was almost blinding now, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. The figure stepped into view, and I realized whatever this was wasn't human. Its face was distorted, twisted into something that wasn't quite alive. No features, no expression, just an abyss of darkness where its eyes should have been. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Panic took over, but my body refused to move. I wanted to look away, to turn the car around and drive back, but my gaze was locked on the creature. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure disappeared. The light faded, leaving me in the same endless darkness. I knew I couldn't stay. I spun my car around, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I drove as fast as I could, barely noticing the trees passing by, the landscape a blur of black and gray. Hours later, I found myself back on a familiar highway, far from the forest. My hands still trembled, and the weight of what I had seen pressed heavily on my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I've never gone back to that stretch of road, and I never will. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. The night had been uneventful at first. I had decided to take a long drive along the old highway that cut through the desolate plains. It wasn't a particularly scenic route, just endless stretches of cracked pavement and empty fields, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of my dashboard. The quiet was almost oppressive. I usually enjoyed solitude, but this felt different, more isolated, more oppressive. As I drove, I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of another vehicle trailing behind. But there was nothing. No other cars, no signs of life. Just the endless road and the hum of my engine. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the horizon curved slightly that something caught my attention. Off to the side, barely visible beneath a thick layer of dust and fog, was an old gas station. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before, but something about it made me slow down. The building was worn, paint peeling, and the sign above it flickered weakly in the night. I decided to stop. It wasn't as if I had much else to do. My phone had lost a signal hours ago and the gas gauge was hovering near empty. Pulling into the station, I cut the engine and stepped out into the stillness. The air was colder than I expected, biting at my skin as I stretched. The station looked abandoned. Cobwebs clung to the windows, and the front door creaked ominously when I pushed it open. Inside, everything was coated in dust. The aisles were empty, shelves leaning precariously, and there was a heavy silence that pressed down on me. I checked the register. Empty. The shelves were stocked, but there wasn't a single item that looked untouched in decades. My footsteps echoed as I wandered further inside, drawn by a sense of curiosity mixed with unease. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. I stopped, my breath hitching. The noise wasn't coming from inside. It was outside, near the side of the building, like someone was dragging something heavy across the gravel. I moved toward the door and cracked it open. Nothing but the dark stretch of road and the fog that clung to the horizon. My heart thumped harder, and I stepped back inside, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. A dragging sound, slower, heavier. I didn't dare go outside, but I stood frozen, waiting for whatever it was to come into view. The noise stopped, as if whatever had been making it had reached the edge of the building, and then silence again. I forced myself to move, back toward the register. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, trying to reconnect to any signal, but the screen stayed blank. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching. I had almost convinced myself to leave when I heard a voice. Soft. Low. Hello? My stomach twisted. It wasn't like any human voice I'd ever heard. Hollow, distorted, as though the words had been dragged through something sinister. I backed further into the station, heart racing. "Who's there?" I called, but my voice shook. The silence stretched, then came the whisper again, closer. "Why are you here?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone was playing some kind of cruel prank, or maybe I was losing my mind. But there was no way to rationalize what was happening. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, moving with an unnatural gait. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles they shouldn't have been. Its face was shadowed, but I could see eyes, dark, hollow pits where the light should have been. I stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf. "No! No!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The thing didn't respond. It continued to move toward me, silent but relentless. Desperation set in. I didn't think, I just ran, back toward the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I shoved the door open, not even bothering to check behind me. The fog outside was thicker now, swallowing the road, the station, everything. I sprinted, not caring where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay there. My legs burned, but I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I found my car and jumped inside. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there, just the road, stretching on endlessly. But I knew whatever had followed me, whatever had been waiting in the shadows of that gas station, wasn't gone. It was still out there, and it wouldn't stop. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run, I knew that, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it, the sound of something else, a faint whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. The first time I saw the figure, I was hiking alone. The trail cut through a remote mountain range, miles from the nearest town. I had decided to spend the weekend camping, seeking peace away from the noise of civilization. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but what I found instead was something I couldn't explain. The morning started off perfect. The air was crisp, the trees towering above me, their leaves whispering in the wind. I made my way up the trail, taking my time, savoring the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the faint calls of distant birds. I reached a clearing near midday, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. It was breathtaking, serene, untouched by modern life. I took a deep breath, sitting down to eat my lunch. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing far in the distance at the edge of the forest. His figure was oddly still, almost too still. He wasn't moving, just watching me. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another hiker perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how unnatural his stillness was. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just stillness. I packed up my things, keeping an eye on him. I told myself I was imagining things. The wind must have carried a shadow, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I set up camp near a small lake, the sun dipping below the horizon as I started a fire. That night, as I lay staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Was he still there, watching me from the forest's edge? I wanted to dismiss the thought, but the longer I sat in silence, the more real it felt. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something outside my tent, a soft rustling. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind now, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking toward my tent. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The campsite was still, empty. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I had no idea what I expected to find, but the sense of someone, or something, out there lingered in my mind. In the morning light, I checked the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. I felt the weight of unease settling deep into my bones, but I packed up and continued my hike, telling myself the encounter was nothing more than paranoia. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something was missing from my pack, one of my water bottles. I searched through my gear, retracing my steps in my mind. The bottle had been full that morning, yet now it was gone. I don't know how it vanished. I know I would have noticed if I'd lost it along the trail. The bottle was one of my last few. Water wasn't plentiful out there, and yet it was gone. I've never returned to those mountains. The memory of that figure, still and silent, watching from the trees, stays with me. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now, long after I've left the wilderness behind. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a family gathering. The roads were mostly empty, the only sound being the occasional hum of my tires on the asphalt. I wasn't particularly familiar with this route. My usual path was blocked off due to some road work, but it was the quickest detour I could take. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the landscape changed. The city lights faded behind me, leaving only dark fields and dense trees. The silence grew oppressive. I had this strange feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. About 20 minutes into the detour, I passed a small, ancient-looking church. Its steeple pierced through the night sky, its silhouette standing stark against the dim moonlight. The church looked abandoned, with vines creeping up its sides, and the windows were shattered, filled with dirt and cobwebs. I shivered despite the warm breeze. As I drove by, my headlights briefly illuminated the graveyard surrounding the church. Tombstones leaned at odd angles, some half buried in the earth. The whole scene felt eerily still, like it wasn't part of this world. I tried to shake the unease that settled in my stomach and pressed on, telling myself it was just an old church. It was the next turn that unnerved me. The road curved sharply into a dense forest. The trees loomed high, their branches interlocking like dark claws above me. The air grew colder, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights barely cut through the fog that had begun to roll in. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, but my pulse quickened with each passing second. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, hollow whispering. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it repeated, clear as day. Follow. I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from inside the car. It seemed to be carried on the wind, drifting from the trees around me. My fingers went numb as I clutched the steering wheel tighter. I scanned the forest, searching for the source, but the trees were motionless, their shadows stretching endlessly. Follow. This time, it was closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to drive away, but my foot wouldn't move. I didn't know if it was fear or something else keeping me there. Suddenly, my headlights flickered. The noise of the engine seemed to fade into the whispering. I could barely hear the tires on the road beneath me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the thick fog. Its outline was dark and impossibly tall. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I should have turned around then, should have left, but my body felt paralyzed. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Follow. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Without thinking, I found myself inching the car forward, the figure still staring, unmoving. It was like it was beckoning me, luring me deeper into the unknown. I don't know how long I drove. The road twisted and turned, every mile feeling longer than the last. The whisper didn't stop, growing louder, as if I were being led deeper into the woods, into whatever nightmare lurked ahead. Finally, the whisper faded. The trees grew thinner. The fog cleared slightly, and I found myself driving onto a dirt path. Ahead of me was a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center stood the church, its shattered windows now gleaming with an otherworldly glow. My heart pounded as I realized the figure was gone. I hesitated, my hands still gripping the wheel, but something compelled me to stop. I didn't know why. My legs felt like they were moving on their own. I stepped out of the car, the ground beneath my feet cold and wet. I approached the church, the whisper now replaced by silence. My footsteps echoed in the stillness. When I reached the church, I stared at the cracked entrance, frozen with fear. But there was nothing. No figure, no whispers, no voices, just an old, abandoned church standing in the cold, dead night. And as I turned to leave, I realized the face I had seen in the cracked window wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. A group of us decided to explore the old, overgrown garden at the edge of town, a place none of us had visited since we were kids. The garden had once been a lush, vibrant place, but now it was a tangled mess of weeds, broken pathways, and twisted trees. We thought it would be a fun adventure, a walk down memory lane, but it ended up being something far more unsettling. The entrance was narrow and hidden by thick undergrowth. We pushed our way through the brambles, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot echoing in the silence. The garden seemed abandoned, almost forgotten. It wasn't large, just a few acres, but there was an eerie stillness to it that felt unnatural. We wandered further in, the air growing heavier as the afternoon wore on. The garden was overgrown, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted in ways that made it feel as though something was always watching us. But none of us said a word. We were too caught up in the nostalgia, the sense of exploration. As we continued walking, we stumbled across a strange sight, a large, old stone fountain at the center of the garden. The fountain had been drained long ago, cracked and moss-covered, but there was something off about it. The water had long since dried up, but beneath the surface something glimmered, an unnatural glint of metal. One of my friends decided to investigate. He climbed over the broken edge of the fountain, peering down into the dark depths. We watched as he ran his flashlight over the cracked stone, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion. "There's something down there," he said, his voice shaking. We all gathered closer, peering over the edge. The glint wasn't just metal, it was a narrow, distorted shape, like a long piece of twisted metal, sticking out from the bottom of the fountain. None of us could make sense of it. It was too unnatural, too strange. One of my friends cautiously lowered a stick down, trying to probe at whatever was below, but it didn't budge. No sound, no shift. It was like whatever was down there wasn't meant to be disturbed. The unease settled deeper into our bones. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice trembling. None of us argued. We started to back away, but as we turned to leave, the air grew colder. A sense of dread clung to us, as though the garden itself didn't want us to leave. That's when we heard the sound, soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper drifting through the trees. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rustling of leaves, it was a voice, so faint we could barely hear it, calling out from the shadows. "Stay, stay with us." I felt my skin crawl. We all stood frozen, the words echoing in our ears. The voice didn't come from any of us, and it didn't seem human. It was hollow, distorted, like it was coming from something far away, yet impossibly close. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered, their breath ragged. None of us dared to speak. The whisper came again, louder this time, and this time I could make out the words, "Stay with us." I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look, but we couldn't move, paralyzed by the sound. The garden had become something else entirely, a place that no longer belonged to us. "Run!" someone finally shouted, breaking the spell. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted through the tangled underbrush, crashing through the trees, fear driving us faster with every step. Behind us, the whispers continued, growing louder. "Stay. Stay with us." We didn't stop until we burst out of the garden, back into the light, our hearts pounding. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No whispers, no figures, nothing. Just the silence of the trees. None of us dared to speak about it again. The garden was still there, but it had changed. Whatever had called to us, whatever had tried to pull us back, was still out there. We never went back. I still don't know how it started. I was on a family trip, just a quiet weekend getaway to an old, abandoned lighthouse by the sea. The kind of place that was supposed to be peaceful, isolated from everything, with nothing but the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. It was just me, my parents, and my sister. The lighthouse towered over us, weathered by time and ocean spray, its white paint flaking off like skin peeling from old wounds. The first day, everything seemed normal. We explored the surrounding cliffs, took photos of the rocky coastline, and enjoyed the solitude. But as night fell, something shifted. We'd set up camp near the base of the lighthouse, far enough away from the cliffs to feel safe, but close enough that the ocean was always within earshot. It was late when I went to sleep, the air thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was my parents or sister talking, but when I opened my eyes, I was alone. The tent was silent except for the crashing waves. Still, the voices continued, low murmurs, too faint to make out but unmistakably there, just outside the tent. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe I was dreaming. I lay there, frozen, trying to ignore it. But then the whispering stopped, and I heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, creeping around the outside of the tent. My heart pounded as I gripped the edge of the sleeping bag. I wanted to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. The footsteps circled the tent, slower now, as if they were inspecting it. The rustling of grass sounded too close, like someone was brushing against the fabric. I forced myself to stay still, waiting for the footsteps to fade. But they didn't. Instead, they grew louder, dragging closer until they were right beside me. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, shallow and uneven, like someone struggling to stay quiet. Then, out of nowhere, a deep, hollow voice spoke. "Let me in." I couldn't scream. My breath hitched as I stared at the fabric of the tent, the sound of the voice lingering in my ears. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Terror gripped me, but I managed to unzip the tent a little, just enough to peek outside. The moonlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could make out a figure standing there. Its shape was distorted, almost unnatural. Too tall, too thin, with skin that shimmered under the moonlight like water. Its face was obscured, shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would disappear if I couldn't see it. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence returned. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my sister's hand when she woke up too. None of us spoke of what happened. We packed up quietly at dawn, trying to act like nothing was out of the ordinary. To this day, I can still hear those whispers. They haunt me every time I hear the ocean. Whatever was out there didn't follow us home, but I know it's still out there, waiting. The day had started off ordinary, just another lazy afternoon. I decided to explore the old abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place everyone whispered about but no one dared to enter. The house had always been shrouded in mystery, sitting at the edge of the forest like a relic from another time. The locals said strange things happened there, whispers in the night, disappearing pets, shadows in the corners of windows. I parked my car on the gravel path and made my way toward the house. The old wooden planks groaned beneath my feet, each step echoing eerily in the quiet. The front door creaked open without much resistance, revealing a dark, empty interior. Dust covered everything and the air smelled of decay. I walked through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Furniture had been overturned, and old photos lay scattered on the floor, their faces faded beyond recognition. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my weight. As I wandered deeper into the house, I began to hear something. Faint whispers, barely audible but persistent. I paused, holding my breath, straining to make out what they were saying. It was almost like the house itself was murmuring secrets, as if the walls were alive with memories. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine and pressed on. The whispers grew louder as I reached the top of the staircase. They seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hall. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed open the door. Inside, the room was bare except for an old mirror standing in the corner. It was cracked, its glass dull and warped. I couldn't look away, compelled by some strange force. As I stared into the mirror, I saw my reflection distort, my face twisting, becoming something wrong. The whispers became screams, louder now, echoing in my ears. I stumbled back, the distorted figure in the mirror now staring at me, its hollow eyes gleaming. I could feel it watching me, not just in the reflection, but in the real world. My breath came in shallow gasps and I backed away from the mirror, tripping over the furniture as I fled the room. As I ran down the hall, I glanced behind me and caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, black and shifting, racing after me. I could hear it breathing, ragged and uneven, closing the distance between us. I burst out of the house, the door slamming shut behind me. The air outside was thick, oppressive, and silent once again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I've never returned to that farmhouse. The whispers still echo in my ears, and sometimes I swear I see that shadow lurking just at the edge of my vision. Whatever was in that house, whatever was chasing me, it's still there, waiting. It was late summer, and my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to an old remote cabin in the woods. But this wasn't your typical cabin-in-the-woods getaway. No flickering lights, no whispers of ghosts. Instead, it was a well-maintained retreat, far from civilization, nestled at the edge of a serene, winding lake. The cabin was beautiful, its wooden exterior weathered but solid, surrounded by towering pines and the soft echo of crickets. We packed our gear, set up by the dock, and spent the day lounging by the water, soaking in the sun, and enjoying the peaceful isolation. The place had a strange charm, almost too perfect, like it had been untouched by time. But that sense of stillness unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place wasn't right. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness stretched across the lake, we gathered around a bonfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The woods were quiet, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. Something off, something watching. I didn't say anything at first. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The others seemed relaxed, laughing and enjoying themselves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone, or something, lurking just beyond the trees. It started small, barely noticeable at first. Shadows flitting between the trees, just out of sight. The sound of footsteps crunching leaves, but no one else seemed to hear them. My pulse quickened and I kept turning, expecting to catch a glimpse of someone, but there was nothing. Or so I thought. As I watched the trees, I noticed the darkness seemed to deepen, more oppressive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then came the whispering. Soft at first, like the wind, but growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't human speech, but something deeper, more guttural. "Come closer." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the woods. It was closer, much closer. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through the air like it was right behind me. My stomach turned. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw them. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, barely visible. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was distorted, like it was bending in ways it shouldn't. Too tall, too thin. Its face was a hollow void. No features, no eyes, just darkness. The whispers came again, louder this time. "Come." I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The others, still by the fire, didn't seem to notice. I wanted to scream, to call out, but no sound would come. Then, like a flicker of a dream, the figure disappeared, swallowed by the trees. The whispering faded, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. When I finally found my voice, I managed to mumble to my friends, trying to act calm, though my hands shook uncontrollably. They brushed off my concerns, laughing and calling me paranoid. We stayed up a little longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that had never truly left. That night, I lay awake, listening to every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside. When morning came, the air felt different. The woods seemed quiet, peaceful even. But as we packed our things and left the cabin behind, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as if something, or someone, was still there, watching us from the shadows.
My mind was screaming in panic. I could still hear the creature, its unsettling sounds echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was far from that barn, my car speeding down the empty road. When I dared glance in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. No barn, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching behind me. I still don't know what I saw that day, or what it was that had been hiding in the darkness. I never went back to that place. I don't need to, because some things are better left unknown. One path stretched ahead, wide and inviting. The other disappeared into the trees, barely a trail. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take the less traveled path, the one that felt like it might lead to something hidden, something forgotten. The further I drove, the deeper the trees became, until the road was almost completely blocked by thick branches. My car slowed to a crawl, crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. It was getting darker now, the sun almost gone, leaving behind only the faint light of dusk. I kept going until I reached what appeared to be an old barn rotting wood and a sagging roof. It stood isolated in a clearing, its once bright red paint now faded to a dull gray. Curiosity got the better of me, and I parked beside it. I stepped out, the quiet almost deafening. I walked towards the barn, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The door was hanging open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest as I pushed it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. Dust floated in the dim light filtering through cracks in the roof. It felt as though no one had stepped inside for years. I explored the barn, half expecting to find some long-lost treasure or a relic from a bygone era. Instead, I found remnants of a past that didn't seem so distant. Rusted tools, empty cages, and old hay scattered across the floor. There was something wrong about the stillness. Then, from the far corner of the barn, I heard a soft, rasping sound. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was faint, but distinct, like something was breathing. Slowly, I turned toward the noise, expecting to find nothing but shadows, but there, crouched in the farthest corner, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a dark shape blending with the shadows. But as I stared, I realized it wasn't human. Its form was twisted, its limbs too long and ungainly, moving in jerky, unnatural ways. I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't look away. The creature, or whatever it was, stared at me with hollow, empty eyes. Its face was indistinct, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Then, it moved. Slowly, as if unsure of itself, it began to rise, its movements erratic, like a marionette with broken strings. I turned and bolted for the door, my breath ragged, the sound of its footsteps echoing behind me. As I ran back to my car, I didn't dare look behind me. My mind was screaming in panic. I could still hear the creature, its unsettling sounds echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was far from that barn, my car speeding down the empty road. When I dared glance in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. No barn, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching behind me. I still don't know what I saw that day, or what it was that had been hiding in the darkness. I never went back to that place. I don't need to, because some things are better left unknown. The sobbing grew louder, but it wasn't human. It was something deep and guttural, pulling at the edges of my sanity. We made it to the car, and I slammed the door behind us, gasping for breath. Jane turned the key, and the engine roared to life, breaking the spell of the storm. As we drove away, I glanced back at the lighthouse, now receding into the distance, and for just a moment, I thought I saw the figure standing on the edge of the pier, watching us go. The last thing I saw was its head turning sharply to the side, its eyes hollow and filled with a desperate longing. When we got back to town, we learned that no one had lived in that lighthouse for over 20 years. The stories were true. Then, the sea had claimed another soul, and now it was waiting for more. It was said that the lighthouse had a history of shipwrecks, that sailors whispered of strange lights in the night. But I'd always dismissed it as superstition. We decided to go up to the lighthouse to see the view. As we climbed the narrow, spiraling staircase, the wind roared louder, slamming against the stone walls like the force of a giant's breath. By the time we reached the top, my legs were shaking, and Jane's face was pale. We both stood in silence, staring out over the stormy ocean. That's when I heard a low, keening sound like someone sobbing. I glanced at Jane, who had heard it too. She nodded, her eyes wide with unease. The wind carried the sound to us, clear and mournful. We edged closer to the railing, trying to make sense of it. There was nothing but the rolling gray water and the dark sky above, but then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure in the distance, just on the edge of the water, its shape blurred by the storm. It was draped in tattered clothing that flapped wildly in the wind. It stood motionless, facing the waves, as if waiting for something to come back to it. Before I could say anything, Jane grabbed my arm. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice shaking. We ran down the stairs, the stone steps slick with the salt spray and our own panic. When we reached the bottom, we turned to look back up at the lighthouse. Through the cracked windows, we could see the shadow of the figure, standing still as the sea raged around it. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. As we stumbled toward the road, the figure started moving toward us, its limbs jerky and unnatural, as if being controlled by some unseen force. The sobbing grew louder, but it wasn't human, it was something deep and guttural, pulling at the edges of my sanity. We made it to the car, and I slammed the door behind us, gasping for breath. Jane turned the key, and the engine roared to life, breaking the spell of the storm. As we drove away, I glanced back at the lighthouse, now receding into the distance, and for just a moment, I thought I saw the figure standing on the edge of the pier, watching us go. The last thing I saw was its head turning sharply to the side, its eyes hollow and filled with a desperate longing. When we got back to town, we learned that no one had lived in that lighthouse for over 20 years. The stories were true. Then, the sea had claimed another soul, and now it was waiting for more. I never thought a simple trip to the county fair would lead to a night I couldn't forget. The fairgrounds were full of lights and music, the sounds of laughter mingling with the creak of carnival rides. It was a warm evening in late summer, the kind that makes you feel alive. My best friend and I had come to eat cotton candy, play games, and ride the Ferris wheel. We were there to have fun. Nothing more. We wandered through the fair, stopping at booths and laughing as I tried to win a stuffed animal from a claw machine. We moved from ride to ride, each one a mix of joy and adrenaline. As the night grew older, the crowds began to thin, the lights reflecting in puddles left by the day's rain. That's when we saw a sign for an attraction we hadn't noticed before, a large tent with wonders of the unseen written across the entrance in faded, curving letters. I nudged my friend and said, "Why not? We haven't tried anything like this yet." He hesitated but agreed, and we stepped into the tent. The air was cool, the scent of damp canvas mixed with something metallic. Inside, a dimly lit space stretched before us, with rows of oddities on pedestals and glass cases. There were strange sculptures, eyes that seemed to watch you, and jars containing things that looked too grotesque to name. We wandered further, entranced by the bizarre display, until I noticed a small, unmarked glass case in the corner. Inside was a piece of paper, old and yellowed, with a single line scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. "Never turn your back on the silent one." A chill ran through me, and I glanced at my friend. He was staring at the case with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Before I could reply, a sound came from the back of the tent. It was a soft thud, followed by a scraping noise that seemed to draw closer. I turned quickly, heart hammering, and saw nothing but shadows. I felt the weight of those unseen eyes, as if the entire tent had shifted, as if it were holding its breath. A sudden scream pierced the silence, coming from somewhere in the dark. My friend's hand gripped mine so hard that it hurt, but I didn't dare look away from the shifting shadows. The scraping sound was louder now, followed by a soft, guttural whisper. "Go, now!" The voice came from behind us. I spun around, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a figure in tattered clothes, its face obscured by a hood. The eyes that peered out from under the fabric were black and deep, a void that seemed to pull at my mind. The whisper came again. "Leave this place. Leave now." I yanked my friend toward the exit, but the tent seemed to stretch, the entrance impossibly far away. We stumbled over discarded objects and felt the air grow colder. The sound of footsteps behind us quickened, a wet, dragging shuffle. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it getting closer. An unnatural presence that made my skin crawl. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we burst through the entrance and into the moonlit fairgrounds. The lights seemed brighter, the noise of the music and laughter louder, as if we had just woken up from a nightmare. We ran to the nearest food stand, gasping for breath, eyes darting back to the entrance of the tent. It was empty. The sign for Wonders of the Unseen now looked torn and tattered, barely hanging on its posts. The tent had vanished, leaving only a dark patch of ground where it once stood. We didn't speak about what had happened that night. It was easier not to, but every now and then, when I hear a sound in the dark or feel something move just out of sight, I remember the whisper, the eyes, and the figure that stood in the shadows. Never turn your back on the silent one, and I know it's still out there. It was the last day of summer, and I decided to take a bike ride out to the old bridge. It was a spot I'd been to countless times before, but something felt different that day. The sun was setting, casting a blood-orange glow over the horizon, and the forest surrounding the path whispered in the warm breeze. I'd been riding for nearly an hour when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped singing, and the crunch of gravel under my tires was the only sound. I slowed down, glancing around nervously. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I reached the bridge, I stopped to rest, propping my bike against the guardrail. Below, the river churned, swollen from weeks of rain. I leaned on the edge, staring down into the dark water, when I heard a faint splashing, as though someone, or something, was moving just below the surface. I squinted, trying to see. The sun was almost gone now, painting everything in shades of purple and indigo. I blinked, and then I saw it to pale, bony hands breaking the water, fingers clawing at the air. I stumbled back, nearly falling over my bike. A chilling, guttural moan rose up from the river, sending a cold wave down my spine. Before I could react, a figure burst out of the water, dragging itself up onto the bridge. Its skin was slick and glistening, half covered in river moss. Its eyes were wide and glassy, locked on mine with a stare that made my blood freeze. It moved with a lurching gait, limbs bending in impossible ways as it crawled forward. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The creature reached out, its fingers twitching, and for a moment I thought it would grab me. But then, a sudden roar echoed through the woods, deep and primal. The creature paused, its head tilting to one side as if it could hear something I couldn't. It let out a sharp, piercing screech, then turned and sprinted back toward the forest, vanishing into the trees with a speed that seemed to defy logic. I stumbled backward, scrambling to my feet and grabbing my bike. Adrenaline surged through me, pushing me forward as I pedaled down the path. The forest was alive with rustling and snapping branches, as if a whole army of things were moving behind me. I didn't dare look back. The ride back was a blur, the world around me reduced to the thumping of my heart and the rhythmic screech of crickets. I finally made it home, slamming the door behind me, locking it as if it would somehow protect me from whatever had emerged from the river. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the sound of water splashing, the shrill scream echoing in my mind. It wasn't until the next morning, when I opened my front door, that I understood the horror of it all. On my porch was a trail of wet, muddy footprints leading from the edge of the woods, where the bridge was, to my doorstep. And in the center of the prints was a small, pale handprint, smeared and barely visible, as if someone had tried to reach out but hadn't quite made it. The woods were still and silent again. But I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in the river hadn't left, and it was still watching. The summer after I graduated high school, my friends and I wanted to celebrate the end of an era with something special. We decided to take a road trip out to the coast, far away from the city, where the ocean met the cliffs. It was supposed to be carefree, a weekend of beachside bonfires, music, and stories under the stars. The road to the secluded beach was narrow, winding through fields of wild grass and dense woods. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when we arrived, the golden light spilling across the sand in brilliant, shimmering waves. The air smelled of salt and something sweet and earthy. We spent the first hour setting up camp and packing the tents, gathering driftwood, and cracking open our first spears of the evening. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The wind picked up, rattling the branches of the trees behind us, making the leaves whisper secrets I couldn't quite understand. It was then that I noticed the silence, no crickets, no waves crashing against the shore. Just the wind and the beating of my own heart. I pushed the feeling aside and joined my friends around the fire. We told stories, some of us laughing, others glancing nervously at the woods behind us. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. But then, just as the stories were reaching their peak, a sound cut through the night. A slow, dragging thud coming from the tree line. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the fire. My friends nodded, but nobody moved. We all turned to look into the darkness beyond the campfire's reach. For a long moment, there was nothing but that deep, uncomfortable silence. Then the sound came again, closer this time, a dragging shuffle that seemed to circle our small clearing. My pulse quickened as I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the dark. Suddenly, the bushes at the edge of the woods rustled, and out stepped a figure. It was impossibly tall, hunched over, its limbs bent at strange angles. The skin was pale and stretched tightly over its bones, its face shadowed by a tangle of wild hair. I couldn't make out its eyes, but the way it moved was enough to send chills down my spine. "Guys, we need to go," I said, my voice quivering. But before anyone could respond, the figure tilted its head and let out a noise that sounded like the screech of nails dragged across glass. "Run!" Someone screamed, and we bolted in different directions, the sand hot beneath our feet, the waves crashing behind us like a deafening roar. I ran toward the water, thinking the sea would be safer, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it moving fast, moving like it was gliding rather than running. My heart raced as I reached the edge of the waves. The creature stopped at the line where the water met the sand, its head tilted as if considering me. It raised one long, thin arm and pointed, then made that scraping, glassy sound again. The air was thick with tension, like everything had paused to hold its breath. I didn't stop to think. I dove into the water, feeling the coldness wrap around me, hoping it would hide me, that it would make me invisible. I heard splashes behind me and turned to see my friends, some already in the shallow water, others just now reaching it. But the creature didn't follow us. It stood at the edge, staring as if trapped by some unseen barrier. After what felt like an eternity, the first rays of dawn illuminated the sky. The creature let out one last, echoing screech before it retreated into the woods. The waves were still loud, but there was no more sound of scraping, no more movement. We stayed in the water, huddled together, too afraid to leave. The sun rose fully, casting light on the beach, showing us the wreckage of our camp, the scattered blankets, the broken cooler, a half-burned log still smoking in the fire pit. But no sign of the creature. When we finally made our way back to the car, no one spoke. We left the coast in silence, looking out the windows and wondering if it was real, if we had all imagined it. A week later, I read an article online about sightings along the coast. People were reporting a tall, pale figure appearing by the woods, dragging its feet and screeching in the dark. I knew then that whatever we had seen, it hadn't been a nightmare. It was out there, waiting for nightfall again, and it was never really gone. I had never been a fan of large gatherings, but when my cousin invited me to her annual summer party at the family vineyard, I couldn't say no. The sprawling estate sat atop a rolling hill, its vineyards glistening under the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of sweet grapes and dry earth, and the distant hum of cicadas added a layer of calm to the scene. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Laughter echoed from the patio where friends and family mingled, glasses clinking as they toasted. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging greetings and grabbing a glass of chilled white wine. As the sun began to set, golden light spilled across the rows of grapevines, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to reach for me. I wandered away from the main gathering, wanting a moment of solitude. The vineyard was beautiful at dusk, the sky streaked with hues of pink and purple. But as I walked deeper into the maze of vines, the air turned cooler, the buzz of the party fading behind me. I turned a corner and found myself at the edge of a small clearing. In the center was an old, rusted metal bench with ivy growing through its slats. I sat down, taking a deep breath as I watched the sky darken. It was then that I noticed a soft, rhythmic thudding sound coming from somewhere nearby. I stood up and looked around, trying to place the noise. It wasn't the wind, it was something much more deliberate. The thumping came again, louder now, from the direction of the old barn at the edge of the vineyard. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started toward it, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet the only sound as I walked. The barn was huge, with weathered wooden doors and broken shutters. I pushed one door open, just enough to peek inside. The dim light revealed dusty barrels, empty crates, and old farming tools. But it was what I heard next that made my blood run cold. A soft, wheezing laugh coming from deep within the shadows. "Hello." My voice trembled as I stepped further in. The laughter stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. Suddenly, the barn door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, as the latch clicked into place. I pounded on the wood, shouting for someone to help me. No answer. I reached into my pocket for my phone, only to find it dead, the screen dark and unresponsive. I turned back to the barn's interior, searching for a way out. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the far end, half hidden in shadow. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural angles. Its head tilted to the side, and I caught a glimpse of its face pale, hollow-eyed, with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. Before I could scream, it moved. The sound of its uneven footsteps sent a jolt of terror through me as I backed away. The barn was suddenly filled with that same wheezing laugh, a sound so jarring I felt it reverberate through my bones. I grabbed a nearby pitchfork and held it out in front of me, the metal cold and trembling in my grip. I charged at the figure, swinging with all the strength I had. The pitchfork sliced through the air and met nothing but thin, cold mist. The figure dissolved before my eyes, leaving only the stench of rotting grapes and the sound of the party outside. The barn door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the night air, gasping. The vineyard was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked back at the barn, the window was dark, and I could swear I saw a pair of hollow eyes watching me from inside. I never spoke of it to anyone, but every year, when the summer party rolls around, I can't help but remember the night I heard that laugh and felt the icy touch of something that wasn't supposed to be there. I had never planned to go to the carnival that night. It was late, the air crisp and stinging as I stepped off the bus, but something about the distant lights and the sound of carnival music drew me in. The streets were almost empty. The only signs of life were the neon lights, casting multicolored reflections in the puddles at my feet. I could hear the faint, cheerful laughter from the fairgrounds, the clatter of the Ferris wheel, and the excited shouts of kids. The carnival was smaller than I'd imagined, nothing more than a cluster of rickety rides and booths run by tired-looking operators. I wandered through, tempted by the smell of fried dough and popcorn, the squeals of kids whirling through the air, their faces frozen in joy. I spent a while watching a clown juggle flaming torches, unable to stop myself from smiling at the effortless act. It was nearing midnight when I found myself by the haunted house. A faded, battered sign read, "Dare to enter only the brave." I laughed at the exaggeration, feeling a sudden thrill at the thought of a little scare. I paid my ticket to the operator, a wiry man whose eyes seemed sharp to knowing. He grinned, a gap-toothed, unsettling smile. "Have fun," he said, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the carnival music. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dark. The air was damp, with the musty scent of old wood and mildew. A low, grinding sound echoed behind me as the door creaked shut, and a surge of nervous excitement washed over me. The hallway was narrow, lined with torn velvet curtains and old paintings that seemed to watch me as I walked past. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. A dissonant chime sounded, and suddenly, a voice whispered from the darkness, "Don't look back." I whipped around, my pulse quickening. Empty. I pushed forward, more out of instinct than reason. The path twisted and turned, each section darker and more sinister than the last. The whispers grew louder, now mixed with the sound of footsteps behind me. I tried to tell myself it was part of the act, but there was something about the way the footsteps echoed, almost as if there were more than one pair. I reached the final room, a small space with a cracked mirror on one wall and an old rocking chair in the middle. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. The rocking chair creaked back and forth, moving with no one sitting in it. Then the voice came again, closer this time, coming from the darkness behind me. "You should never have come here." I spun around and gasped. A figure stood at the far end of the room, its shape shrouded in the dark. I could just make out the outline of its twisted limbs and a face that was impossibly, grotesquely contorted. It stepped forward, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it were a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen hand. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. "It's not real," I whispered, the sound cracking in the silence. But the figure kept coming, inch by inch, dragging its feet as it advanced. The mirror shattered, a sharp, piercing sound that made me jump. The operator's voice, now louder and clearer, resonated through the room. "I warned you." I made a run for it, throwing myself at the door. It opened, and I stumbled out into the night, panting and shaking. The carnival music was still playing, but now it sounded distorted, warped, as if it were coming from far, far away. I glanced back, and for a split second, I saw it standing in the doorway of the haunted house, watching, waiting. Its face, a mirror of mine, but cracked and twisted, grinned at me before vanishing into the dark. I didn't look back as I ran to the bus stop. But when I finally sat down, trying to catch my breath, I caught my reflection in the window. My eyes were wide, and a thin, red line was traced down my cheek, as if someone had drawn it with a blade. And then I realized I wasn't alone. There was a shadow in the seat behind me, perfectly still, waiting. I never thought a simple apartment would be the place where I'd experience something so terrifying. It started out like any other routine, working long hours, barely having enough time to eat, and coming back to my cramped, inexpensive apartment late at night. The building I lived in wasn't great, but it was cheap. And it was close to my job. It was an old place, with narrow hallways and flickering lights that made me feel like I was in a horror movie. Most of the tenants were quiet, reclusive types, people who just wanted to live in peace without much hassle. One evening, I returned from work and noticed something off. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar, not wide open, just a crack, as if someone had left in a hurry or forgotten to fully close it. I don't know why I didn't think twice about it. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt that unease creeping in. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, like it wasn't circulating properly. I closed the door behind me and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Everything seemed in its place, no signs of a break-in, no obvious disturbances. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until I went to the bathroom that I found it. The mirror, it wasn't cracked, but it was smeared. I could see fingerprints along the edges, almost like someone had pressed their hands against it and slowly moved them around, leaving greasy streaks. I didn't know how I didn't notice it earlier. I had been in the bathroom just that morning. I wiped the mirror clean, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing faint noises, scraping sounds, like nails dragging against the floor. They weren't constant, but every now and then, I'd hear them from somewhere outside my bedroom door. I told myself it was just the building settling, an old structure making strange noises, but then I heard something else. A whisper, just outside my door. It was a voice, soft and almost melodic, but it made my blood run cold. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't my imagination. It was clear, too real to ignore. The whispering continued, a low hum that seemed to get closer with every passing minute. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, wondering if someone had broken in. But if they had, why didn't they make a sound when they came in? I crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I stood still for a moment, waiting for any sound. The whispering stopped, and I thought I'd imagined it. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stepped out into the hallway and looked around. Nothing. It was just the usual dim lighting and the closed doors of other apartments. But the air felt wrong, colder than usual. As I walked back to my apartment, I glanced toward the elevator. It was an old, creaky thing, but it was never in use at night. Except tonight, it was moving, slowly, the lights flickering as it descended. I froze. The elevator doors opened, and no one was inside. I didn't waste another second. I rushed back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I was losing control of everything, my thoughts, my senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me for days. Something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The next morning, I went to the landlord's office to ask about the strange events. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the building for years. She looked at me with a concerned expression when I mentioned hearing noises and seeing the elevator move on its own. "Oh, that happens sometimes," she said, her voice low and almost too calm. "The building has a history." I was about to ask her what she meant when she continued, "People hear things in this place, footsteps, whispers, and sometimes the elevator moves by itself. It's just the old pipes. You know, the building settles." She smiled politely, but there was something off about her tone. "Don't worry, though, it's harmless." I didn't feel reassured. That night, the same strange things happened again. The whispering, the scratching, the elevator. But this time, something changed. The whispering wasn't just a voice, it was my voice. It was me, but not me. A distorted, mocking version of my own voice, saying things I hadn't even thought. Things like, "You're still here and it's only just begun." Panicked, I rushed to the bathroom to see if I was imagining things. But then I saw the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't my reflection. There was a woman standing in my place, her face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite recognize. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and she was smiling. I stumbled back, almost falling over, and as I turned to run, I heard her voice, clear as day, from behind me. "You're not leaving." It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of life. My friends and I rented an old cabin in the woods. Remote, quiet, peaceful, or so we thought. We arrived just before sunset, the air thick with the smell of pine. The cabin was small but charming, nestled between towering trees, the kind of place you see in postcards. The first night, we gathered around the fireplace, chatting about everything and nothing, enjoying the crackling of the fire. The wind outside was gentle, almost soothing, and we settled in for a comfortable night. But as the evening wore on, something strange started happening. It was subtle at first, just a chill in the air that crept in even though the fire was blazing. Then there was the sound, a soft, scraping noise from somewhere deep in the house. It was faint at first, like nails on wood. I ignored it, attributing it to the old house settling. Then, the knock came. It was a soft tap on the door, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Everyone stopped talking. We all glanced at the door, confused. The knocking continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. We were miles away from any neighbors. There was no way anyone could have wandered up here without us hearing them. We all got up and checked the door, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing, no one. Just the dark, empty woods. We laughed it off, assuming it was some odd sound from the house itself. But as the night wore on, things started to feel off. The temperature dropped, the wind picked up, but it wasn't the usual gusts of wind. It was unnaturally consistent, like something was pushing against the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud bang. It echoed through the cabin like someone had slammed a door somewhere. I immediately sat up, heart racing, and listened. The wind had stopped. Everything was eerily silent. Then, the same scraping sound started again, this time from just outside my room. I got up slowly, my feet heavy on the floorboards, trying not to make a sound. I peeked out through the small crack in my door. Nothing, just the dark hallway stretching out in front of me. But then, I saw a movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing still at the far end of the hall, half hidden in shadow. It was tall. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing on my chest. I couldn't breathe. I stepped back into my room, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to shut out the fear. The next morning, the others didn't seem as rattled. We all pretended like nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had been watching us. Later, that afternoon, we decided to take a hike to clear our heads. We walked through the woods, the trees whispering above us in the wind. As we returned to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was ajar wide open. We had locked it before we left. We rushed inside, but everything seemed normal. No sign of forced entry. Nothing out of place. Just the same unsettling quiet that had followed us since the first night. But when I passed the hallway mirror, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was something behind me. A shadow standing, just out of view, its outline faint but unmistakable. I spun around. Nothing. I was alone. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? They wouldn't believe me. But that night, I stayed awake, watching every creak and groan of the house. The door remained locked, but I could feel it. Something was still out there, watching. We left the next morning, eager to put the cabin behind us. But when we returned home, I received a message from Mark. He had gone back to the cabin alone a week later to retrieve something he'd forgotten. When he went inside, everything seemed fine until he found something strange on the kitchen counter. There was a note. It read, "You were never supposed to leave." He never went back. To this day, I have no idea what was at that cabin. But I know one thing for sure, we weren't the only ones there. I've always loved old houses, the creaking floors, the smell of dust and history. It all felt comforting to me. So, when a friend of mine offered me a weekend stay in a remote house she had recently inherited, I jumped at the chance. It was an isolated 2-story place, surrounded by thick woods, and from the moment I arrived, something about it felt off. The first night, I felt fine. My friend had warned me about the odd noises, saying it was just an old house settling, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't heard anything normal. Every creak, every faint whisper in the walls made my skin crawl. I brushed it off. It was just the house settling, right. That night, I decided to sleep on the couch downstairs. The upstairs felt too isolated, too empty. I tried to make myself comfortable, wrapping myself in a blanket as the night grew colder. The wind outside howled, but it didn't bother me much. I'd always liked the sound of a storm. At around 3 a.m., I was woken by a strange noise. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. My heart skipped. I knew no one was supposed to be here with me. I stood up, thinking maybe my friend had come down for something, but when I peeked upstairs, the hall was empty. I stood frozen, trying to decide whether I should go back to sleep or investigate. The footsteps grew louder. They were now coming down the stairs. I froze, not daring to move. The stairs creaked with each step. 1, 2, 3. I could hear the weight of each footfall, as if someone was walking slowly down toward me. But when I looked, no one was there. My pulse quickened. I looked over at the staircase, feeling an overwhelming urge to check. Slowly, I stood and made my way to the foot of the stairs. The air had gotten colder, almost icy, but nothing was there. No one was coming down. Relieved, I laughed to myself, thinking it must have been my mind playing tricks. I walked back to the couch, but as I sat down, the unmistakable sound of breathing reached my ears. It was slow, steady, but coming from right behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone there. But nothing. The room was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my head was spinning. Maybe it was just my nerves and overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I got up and locked all the doors. I even pushed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't pinpoint why. When I checked the windows, everything outside was dark, still. No movement, just the wind. Around 4 a.m., I decided to leave the house. I didn't feel safe there anymore, but as I grabbed my bag, something caught my eye in the hallway mirror. It was my reflection only. It wasn't quite right. I stared at the mirror, confused. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't smiling. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse racing, but when I looked back, it was gone. The smile was gone, and the reflection seemed normal again. I grabbed my things and ran out of the house, not looking back until I was safely in my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in there. Watching me. The next morning, I got a message from my friend. It was a simple text. "Did you hear anything last night?" I texted her back, asking what she meant. Her response sent a chill down my spine. "I forgot to tell you there's a family who used to live there. They all died in a fire in the house years ago. People say their spirits are trapped in the walls, still walking around, still breathing." I felt my stomach drop. What did I see in that mirror? Was it one of them? Had they been there all along, waiting for someone to notice? The last thing she wrote haunted me long after I left. The weird thing is, sometimes people leave that house, but they never seem to fully leave. The spirits follow them, always. Now, months later, I still don't sleep well. And sometimes, when I glance at a mirror, I swear I see a faint, twisted smile in the reflection someone, or something, just behind me. But when I turn around, nothing is there, and I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting to follow me again. It started on a late autumn night when a friend and I decided to explore an abandoned house just outside of town. It had been empty for decades, the kind of place that fueled urban legends. People whispered about lights flickering in the windows and strange noises coming from inside. Naturally, we were curious, the way only young people, with nothing better to do, could be. The house was enormous, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of neglect. The windows were broken, and the front door hung on rusted hinges. We had brought flashlights, but I remember the beams barely cutting through the dense darkness inside. The air smelled of mildew and rot. Leaves crunched underfoot as we stepped onto the warped floorboards. The entryway opened into a cavernous living room. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghosts in the gloom. A grand staircase loomed to the left, its banister coated in cobwebs. We agreed to start upstairs, feeling braver together. The steps groaned beneath our weight, each creak reverberating through the empty house. As we reached the landing, I noticed the unsettling silence. No wind, no animal sounds. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The first few rooms were empty, just peeling wallpaper and broken glass. But the third door was different. It was shut tight, unlike the others that swung open with ease. I felt a strange resistance when I turned the knob, as if something was pressing back from the other side. My friend joked that it was probably swollen from the damp, but I could see he was uneasy too. When the door finally gave way, it revealed a small bedroom. The walls were painted a faded pink, and a child's bed frame sat against one wall. But what drew my attention was the dresser. Its mirror was intact, unlike the broken shards scattered throughout the house. As I stepped closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the reflection, the room wasn't empty. There was a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the corner, but there was no one there. I glanced back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. My friend had seen it too. He was pale, his flashlight shaking slightly. Neither of us said a word, but we backed out of the room. Shutting the door firmly behind us, we decided to leave, suddenly feeling like we had overstayed our welcome. As we descended the staircase, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The house seemed darker now, the air heavier. Just as we reached the front door, we heard it. A loud crash from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. My friend looked at me, his eyes wide. Against my better judgment, I suggested we check it out. I didn't want to be the person who ignored something like that, only to regret it later. We crept back up the stairs, every creak of the wood amplifying the tension. The crash had come from the same bedroom. This time, the door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we found the room exactly as we had left it except for the mirror. It was shattered, shards of glass littering the floor. The frame was twisted, almost as if it had been torn apart by something stronger than human hands. I knelt to pick up a shard, curiosity overriding fear. That was when I noticed something chilling. The pieces of glass reflected not just us, but the entire room except for the space behind us. It was blank, a void where the rest of the room should have been. I dropped the shard and stumbled back, my breathing ragged. That was when we heard the whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A single word, drawn out and raspy. Leave. It didn't sound like a plea or a warning. It sounded like a command. My friend didn't wait. He bolted down the stairs, and I was right behind him. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. The house stood silent and still, its dark windows staring back at us. But, as we turned to leave, I saw something in the upper window. A shadow. Unmoving. Watching us. We drove back to town in silence, neither of us wanting to talk about what had happened. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something chilling. The mirror in my bedroom, which I had owned for years, had a crack running through it. And in that crack, faintly, I could see the outline of a figure. It was late in the afternoon, and the park was starting to empty out. Most visitors had left for the day, and I was finishing up some paperwork in the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. There was a report of a strange sighting near one of the old trails, a popular spot, but not heavily trafficked. No one had gone out there in weeks, so the call struck me as odd. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed out, thinking it was probably just someone messing around. The air was crisp, and a thick mist had rolled in from the valley, making the trees look like towering shadows. The sun was setting fast, and the forest had a quiet, unnerving stillness to it. I made my way along the trail, the light from my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows across the path. The deeper I went, the more the mist seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Every twig that cracked underfoot sounded too loud, too unnatural. I paused a moment, listening for anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I heard an unmistakable noise. A child's laughter. It echoed through the trees, high-pitched and clear. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching. There hadn't been any kids on the trail that day. And this wasn't the kind of sound you would expect to hear in the middle of the woods at dusk. The laughter was faint, almost playful, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound like a normal laugh. It sounded hollow, distant, as if it were coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I tried to brush it off, but then it came again, closer this time. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. No response. Only the laughter. Louder now, taunting and echoing through the trees. I hesitated, but I knew I had to investigate. I wasn't about to leave the woods in the dark without figuring out what was going on. I followed the sound deeper into the mist. The trail narrowed, and the trees seemed to grow taller and closer, casting dark shadows over the path. The laughter continued, now mixed with strange, choppy breathing, like someone was struggling to speak. The hair on my arm stood on end. I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. There, standing at the edge of the path, was a figure, a little girl. She was dressed in an old-fashioned, frilly white dress that looked out of place for the woods. Her hair was long and tangled, falling over her face so I couldn't see her eyes. She was facing away from me, just standing there, perfectly still. My heart started to race, and the laughter stopped. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to step forward, calling out to her, "Hey, are you lost? Are you okay?" She didn't move. I took another step, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The moment my beam hit her head jerked up sharply. The face that met me was not that of a child. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that was far too large for any human face. I stumbled back, the light flashing wildly around the trees. Suddenly, the mist shifted and parted in a way that felt unnatural, revealing a massive shape behind her. A shadow so large and dark it swallowed up everything around it. It was moving, slowly, like it was testing its weight with each step. I could barely make out a shape, something monstrous, towering over the little girl. It was like a large, misshapen figure, too blurry to be fully understood, but I could feel its presence in every bone of my body. The laughter came back, but now it was frantic, echoing from all directions. "Run!" I yelled at the girl, though I knew she wouldn't move. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted back the way I came, my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. My breath was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back, but I could hear the sound of something heavy moving behind me, the ground shaking with every step. I finally broke through the mist and back onto the main trail. The air felt suddenly lighter, and the world seemed normal again, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there, panting, looking around. No towering figure, no girl, no strange laughter. Just the normal sounds of the forest at night. It wasn't until I got back to the ranger station that I noticed it on the back of my neck, just under my jacket collar, was something damp. I reached up and pulled it off, and in my hand was a small tuft of hair, but it wasn't mine. I've never been the superstitious type, but there's something about the woods at night that can shake anyone's resolve. That's how I found myself telling this story. Years after the incident, it started like any other camping trip with friends. We set up camp late in the afternoon near an old trail, a secluded place we'd been to before. It wasn't a popular spot, so we had the area to ourselves, which was the whole point. The fire crackled while we sat around it, cracking jokes and making plans to hike the next day. Everyone was in a good mood. Nothing out of the ordinary. That was until night fell. The fire was the only light around us. The woods around our little camp were thick, and the only sounds came from the occasional owl hooting in the distance. We weren't in a haunted area, but something about the forest seemed different this time. We tried to shake it off, laughing it off, but there was an unease that grew heavier as the minutes passed. I remember getting up to get more firewood, and that's when I noticed it. The trees weren't moving. Normally, in the woods, even a light breeze makes the branches rustle. But here, everything was still. The only movement came from the flames. It felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, but the silence kept pressing down on me. When I got back to the fire, I mentioned it casually to the others. They laughed it off, of course, but then we all heard it. A low, distant humming sound, not like the wind, but more like a tune. It was eerie too eerie for any of us to take lightly. My friend Alan was the first to speak up. He said it sounded like chanting, but I didn't want to admit that it gave me the same feeling. He wanted to investigate, but everyone was already on edge. We agreed to stay close to the fire, even if it meant looking paranoid. The humming seemed to get closer, and then it stopped. That's when the first jump scare hit. Out of nowhere, something large and heavy crashed into the trees behind us. I thought it was an animal, but the noise was so unnatural, so forceful. It was like something was thrashing around, trying to make its way through the brush, but it wasn't moving like an animal. It was more like something struggling to get to us, something angry. We all froze. The fire flickered and popped. Our nerves were frayed, but no one moved. The humming started again, quieter this time, and in the silence that followed, it almost felt as though something was watching us. Alan wanted to run and check it out, but I stopped him. I couldn't explain why, but my instincts told me staying put was the only way to be safe. Then the real terror hit. The trees near the edge of our camp started to shake. I saw movement shapes, shadows flitting between the trunks. It was fast, too fast, and it wasn't a human shape. It was tall, hunched, like something trying to stay hidden, but it couldn't. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes. They were watching us. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Everyone else was just as still. We didn't even make a sound. We just waited, frozen. Then came the worst part. The ground trembled under our feet. We couldn't tell if it was a tremor or something heavier. The humming turned into a deep growl, and the trees began to crack. Then we heard a voice clear, sharp. It didn't sound human. It came from somewhere far off, but it echoed as if it was coming from right next to us. Stay away. Those two words shook me to my core. No one moved. We were stuck, glued to the spot. I can't even remember how long we stayed there, but it felt like hours. The shadows started to fade, the trembling stopped, and the eerie humming turned back into silence. Then, just as we thought it was over, we heard a different sound. This time, it was close. Something was walking around our camp, slow and deliberate. I could hear footsteps to heavy, to slow. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in sharp gasps. I thought it was something real, something we couldn't escape. But when I turned to Alan, I saw the fear in his eyes. I knew we weren't alone. But this wasn't what we thought. The footsteps didn't stop. Then, out of nowhere, the fire blinked out, and the world went pitch black. We were completely surrounded, but we still couldn't move. My hands shook, and I heard breathing too close. When the light came back, we saw something on the ground. A small, old-fashioned lantern sat in the dirt. It wasn't ours. We never found out who or what had left it there. The chanting faded. The trees resumed their normal stillness. But from that moment on, we didn't speak of what had happened. except in whispers. And if you ever find yourself camping alone, listen carefully. The forest has its own way of communicating. I can't explain it, but I know that voice was a warning. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just me and a few friends. We set out into the woods, eager for some fresh air, hiking, and quiet nights around the fire. Nothing could go wrong. We pitched our tents by a small clearing beside a narrow stream, the trees around us thick, and the forest alive with the usual sounds of nature. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, laughing, joking, and snapping pictures. We returned to camp just as the sun was dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. By nightfall, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. But when the fire crackled down to embers, something shifted. It was a subtle change, but it didn't go unnoticed. The air felt colder, heavier. The rustling of the trees grew louder, more frantic. I remember thinking it was odd how the usual chorus of night creatures had gone quiet. No crickets, no owls, no rustling leaves, just silence. It made the firelight seem far too small against the vast, looming dark. I wasn't the only one who felt it. I caught my friends glancing around, eyes darting to the edges of the trees, as though they were hearing things too. But when I asked if anyone else felt it, they shrugged it off. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to laugh it off, but there was a tension in the air that none of us could shake. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning in my tent, the sense of being watched pressing down on me. The next morning, we decided to pack up early. We'd seen all we needed to see, and the unease from the night before isn't something any of us wanted to ignore. But, as we began to gather our things, something strange happened. My friend Dave, who had been the first to wake up, looked horrified. He was staring at the ground near his tent, his face pale. Hey, guys, you might want to look at this. We followed him over, all of us a little nervous. At first, I thought it was just an animal track, perhaps a deer or a bear, but when I crouched down to inspect it, my heart skipped a beat. The print was enormous, far too large for any animal I knew to live in these woods. It was human-shaped, but twisted, the toes far too long, and the heel unnaturally deep. That's not possible, I whispered. As we all stood there, trying to make sense of it. A sudden rustling came from the tree line. It was fast to be an animal, and too deliberate to be the wind. We froze, hearts racing, but nothing emerged. Dave suggested we leave immediately, and no one argued. We packed up quickly, I scanning the surrounding woods as we hurried to break down the camp. The trees around us were unnervingly still, the silence now deafening, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We were halfway back to the car when it happened. A scream, sharp, ragged, and full of terror, split the air. We spun around, instinctively searching the woods. At first, we saw nothing, just the dark expanse of trees. But then, we noticed something out of place. Between the trunks, a figure was standing just out of reach of the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its outline was too faint to make out in detail. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it moved. The figure stepped forward with a smooth, unnatural grace, its long, spindly limbs stretching far beyond what should have been possible. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but its presence was enough to paralyze us with fear. Run, Dave finally managed to rasp, and we did. We ran through the woods like we'd never run before, stumbling, tripping, barely able to keep our footing. The figure was gone, but we all felt its eyes on us, following every step. We reached the car, breathless, eyes wild. The woods behind us seemed impossibly far away as we drove, the eerie silence still clinging to the air. But it wasn't until we were miles down the road, trying to shake off the adrenaline, that we realized something strange. We'd left our phones back at camp. We stopped at a gas station to grab a charger and checked our messages. There was one, sent to all of us in the middle of the night. I see you. It had come from Dave's phone. But when we checked it, he was sitting right next to us. His phone was in his hand, and it hadn't been touched. We all stared at it, the words hanging in the air. How had it sent that message, and, more terrifyingly, who had sent it? It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. A few friends, a campsite in the woods, and a kind of quiet that can only come from being far off the beaten path. We thought we were prepared: tents, a campfire, enough food for 2 days, and a cooler full of cold drinks. But I'll never forget how quickly that peace shattered. It started with the walk to the site. We arrived late in the afternoon, and there was something off about the air. It was thick, almost suffocating, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. It was just the wilderness, right? Nature doing its thing. But the closer we got to our spot, the more the trees seemed to close in on us. The path grew narrower, and the shadows grew deeper. By the time we set up camp, the sun was barely a sliver in the sky. I'd heard the stories about strange things happening in the woods, voices on the wind, lights flickering in the distance, but I was skeptical. I was determined to have a good time, not let the usual campfire tales spook me. We set up the tents, lit the fire, and joked around. I figured it'd be the perfect escape, but then came the first odd thing. Around dusk, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, just standing there, watching. At first, I thought it was a person who had wandered off the trail, maybe another camper. But there was something wrong about how still they were. No shifting of weight, no fidgeting, just watching. I pointed it out to my friends, but when they turned to look, it was gone. I laughed it off. My friends did too. It was probably an animal or a trick of the light. But then, as the fire crackled and the darkness deepened, I noticed something else: soft, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking just outside the camp. Again, I told myself it was nothing. But the footsteps continued. They circled the camp, first to the left, then to the right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. At one point, I heard the unmistakable sound of a breath, shallow and quick, like someone was standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My friend Sam whispered, "Did you hear that?" We all heard it. Soft voices, too faint to make out, were carried on the breeze. They didn't sound like words, more like whispers, but the tone was unmistakable, a low murmur, as if a group of people was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, talking in a language none of us understood. That's when we decided it was time to go. We started packing up our things, but as I turned to grab the cooler, I saw something that made my heart stop: a handprint on the outside of the tent, smeared, like something had been pressing against it. But we had all been standing inside the tent the entire time. No one had touched it. We stared at it for a long time, the fire crackling in the silence between us. The footsteps had stopped, but the whispers were getting louder, more insistent. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the trees. A figure, crouched low, weaving through the trunks. It was too fast, too fluid to be a person, too wrong. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My legs were frozen. That's when the first true jump scare hit. A loud bang, like something heavy being thrown against our tent. The entire structure shook, and the fire flickered, casting distorted shadows across the ground. We all stumbled back, our breaths ragged, and that's when we saw an unmistakable trail of blood, starting from the edge of the camp and leading toward the woods. It wasn't animal blood. It was too dark, too thick. We ran. There was no hesitation. We grabbed what we could, threw it in the truck, and sped off, hearts hammering in our chests. When we finally got home, we thought it was over. But a few days later, as I was unpacking my bag, I found something in my jacket pocket: a small, torn scrap of fabric, dark red, stained with something that looked like dirt. But the strangest part, the fabric was exactly like the material of the tents we had set up that weekend. I stared at it for what felt like hours. My thoughts scrambled. Had something been with us in the woods? Something that we didn't see? Had it been in our tent the entire time? I didn't want to think about it, but the more I tried to push the thought away, the clearer it became. The whispers, the figure in the trees, the handprint, the blood trail, and that piece of fabric, something that definitely wasn't ours. We never went back to those woods. But I still wonder, what was it that we didn't see? What was circling our camp, watching us, following us? Whatever it was, it didn't let us go. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the noise of the city and unwind in nature with my friends. We picked a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any trails or cabins. Just the four of us: me, Alex, Jenna, and Marcus. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, the atmosphere filled with laughter as the sun dipped below the horizon. As darkness enveloped the camp, we roasted marshmallows and shared stories that ranged from silly to spine-chilling. I felt a warm glow inside as I watched my friends enjoy the night, but it didn't last long. Alex suggested we play a game of truth or dare. I remember feeling a little uneasy about it. Something about the looming trees seemed to echo our laughter, almost mocking it. When it was my turn, I chose truth. I was asked about my biggest fear. I shared that I was terrified of being lost in the woods, alone and unable to find my way back. They laughed it off, but as I looked into the darkened tree line, I felt that familiar chill creep up my spine. After the game, Jenna suggested a night hike. I hesitated but agreed, thinking it would be a fun adventure. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down a narrow path surrounded by thick trees. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. At first, we walked in jovial spirits, joking and laughing. But as we moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The wind picked up, causing the branches to sway and creak ominously. The sound of rustling leaves became unnaturally loud. I started to feel anxious, and I glanced around, noticing the darkness felt thicker here. Suddenly, we heard a noise, a distant, strange sound like metal scraping against metal. My heart raced. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to mask my fear. The others nodded, their faces pale. We decided to follow the sound, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. As we crept forward, the noise grew louder. It wasn't just one sound, but a symphony of clanging and thudding, echoing through the trees. The lights from our flashlights flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to swirl ominously. I felt an urge to turn back, but the others pushed forward. Finally, we reached a clearing, and the scene before us froze me in place. Several figures were silhouetted against a flickering light, standing in a circle. They wore tattered clothing and strange masks made of bark and leaves. Each held a lantern, illuminating their expressions, which were a mix of excitement and something darker. My stomach churned as I realized they were not just hikers, but a strange, almost cult-like gathering. Before we could process what we were witnessing, one of the figures spotted us. A loud, eerie laughter erupted from the group, sending chills down my spine. Panic set in, and we turned to run, but the path behind us felt altered, the trees closing in as if they were shifting, trapping us. We stumbled through the underbrush, desperately trying to find our way back to camp. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the laughter that chased us. Just when I thought we were lost forever, we burst through the trees and back into our campsite, breathing heavily. But the camp wasn't how we left it. The fire pit was extinguished, the tents were torn, and our backpacks were scattered. In the center of the campsite was a single lantern, lit and flickering. Scrawled in the dirt around it were the words, "We've been waiting." Fear washed over us as we scrambled to gather our things. I glanced back toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figures watching us. We didn't speak as we packed, but the silence was thick with dread. We drove off in a rush, the night closing in around us. As we hit the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty road behind us. Instead, I saw one of those figures standing at the edge of the woods, holding its lantern high, its face obscured by a mask. The last thing I remember is the figure raising a hand and pointing at me. And then we were gone. To this day, I avoid the woods, and I can never shake the feeling that they are waiting for me to return. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends. We drove to a secluded area, far from the noise of the city, hoping to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, my friends Jake, Sarah, Lily, and Mark. We pitched our tents under the trees, the sound of the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to our laughter. As night fell, the woods transformed, the shadows deepened, and the familiar sounds of the forest turned ominous. I suggested we tell ghost stories, thinking it would be a laugh. But as we shared tales of lost souls and wandering spirits, I could feel an unsettling chill creeping in. Jokingly, Jake dared us to go for a midnight hike to explore the woods. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. As we walked deeper, I noticed that the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. That's when we heard a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. Was it a wolf? The sound sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to press on, hoping to laugh it off once we were back at camp. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The howling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a faint rustling. Suddenly, Mark, who had been trailing behind, screamed. We turned to see him pointing toward a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall silhouette, swaying slightly, its outline obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out any details. I felt paralyzed, fear gripping me like a vice. Is that a person? Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before anyone could respond, the figure lurched forward. Panic erupted among us. We turned to run, but my foot snagged on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled after my friends. We burst back into the clearing, breathless and shaken. I quickly checked to see if everyone was okay. Mark was pale, his eyes wide with fear. What was that thing? He gasped. I don't know, but we should pack up and leave, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurriedly gathered our things, our earlier bravado completely forgotten. As we worked, the haunting howl rang out again, echoing in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, mocking our fear. With our gear hastily stuffed into backpacks, we turned to leave when Jake suddenly froze, his eyes wide. The fire, he said, pointing. The flames had flared up unexpectedly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. We had extinguished it before heading into the woods, but now it blazed brighter than ever, illuminating the trees around us. What the hell? Lily exclaimed. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized something was off. The firelight revealed a pattern in the dirt around it, something we hadn't seen before. Scratches and markings that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. It looked like words, but twisted, as if they had been clawed into the ground. Get away from the fire, I yelled, panic rising again. We stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames. The howls returned, but now they were accompanied by a rustling sound, like branches snapping. Shadows danced wildly around us, the flames illuminating the silhouettes of figures hiding just outside the light's reach. We were trapped. Then, just as we were about to bolt, the fire suddenly died down to embers, plunging us into darkness once more. The figures became clear now, dozens of them, watching silently from the tree line, their faces obscured by the night. In a flash, I recalled a story had heard years ago, about a camping group that vanished without a trace, the only clue being markings found in the dirt. They had been lured into the woods by the firelight, just like we had been. In that moment, we understood. We weren't just in a haunted forest. We were part of a sinister game, and we had unknowingly walked into their territory. With adrenaline pumping, we bolted toward the path that led back to our car. As we ran, I could hear their footsteps behind us, almost mocking. I glanced back one last time and saw them emerging from the shadows, eyes glinting like hungry predators. We reached the car, breathless and terrified, and peeled away from the campsite, leaving behind the twisted horror of the woods. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was a figure standing by the dying embers, watching us leave, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt their presence. The camping trip started as a way to escape the chaos of city life. My friends and I set off into the wilderness, our spirits high and supplies packed. We found a secluded spot near a lake, surrounded by towering trees. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, laughter echoing through the woods. Yena had brought a deck of cards, and we played games until the stars blanketed the sky. Once the games faded into silence, Matt suggested a night hike. Yena looked hesitant, but was quickly swept up in the excitement. I had always loved the woods, so I was all in. As we made our way down a narrow path, the moonlight filtered through the trees, creating an ethereal glow. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature surrounded us. But then we heard something, a faint rustling, that made me stop in my tracks. I brushed it off as the wind and continued walking, though an unsettling feeling settled in my stomach. We pressed on, deeper into the woods, but the sense of unease lingered. Just when I thought we'd enjoy a peaceful walk, a loud snap echoed in the stillness. It sounded like a branch breaking, but the sound was too close for comfort. Gina's eyes widened, and she whispered that we should go back. But before we could turn around, we caught sight of something moving in the distance. A figure was partially illuminated by the moonlight, standing still among the trees. It looked human, but was too far away to see clearly. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step forward, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and fear. But the moment I did, the figure suddenly darted behind a tree. It was quick and too agile for comfort. My instincts screamed to get back to camp, but curiosity got the better of me. I urged my friends to follow, and we moved cautiously toward the area where we'd seen the figure dot. As we got closer, the air felt heavier, almost electric. I shone my flashlight around, but the woods seemed to swallow the light. The figure was gone. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and the laughter we shared earlier faded into a tense silence. Just then, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that sent chills up my spine. "Help me." We froze, hearts pounding, searching for the source of the voice. It sounded desperate and distant, echoing through the trees. Yena gripped my arm tightly, and we all turned in unison toward the sound, which seemed to draw us deeper into the woods. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably human. "Help me." Compelled by a mix of fear and concern, I led the group further into the darkness, following the voice that begged for help. As we walked, the whispering intensified, morphing into frantic cries. The air grew colder, and shadows danced menacingly around us. Suddenly, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit old cabin, the kind you only see in horror movies. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar. The cries for help echoed from inside, now sounding almost pleading. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I couldn't turn back. We had to see what was going on. We approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking under our feet as we stepped inside. The air was stale, and the smell of decay filled the space. The cries for help were now frantic, almost desperate. I felt a pull, as if something was urging me to go deeper into the cabin. My friends hung back, uncertainty etched on their faces. Then, as I turned to look into one of the dark rooms, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart raced, and I whirled around, panic rising. The cries turned into laughter, echoing around me. It was a sinister, mocking sound that sent waves of dread through my body. I pounded on the door, yelling for my friends. The door creaked open, and I stumbled back into the clearing, breathless. My friends stood there, eyes wide with fear. They hadn't heard any cries. They hadn't heard anything. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that blanketed the area. I felt my stomach drop as realization hit. We had followed a voice that wasn't there, led into a trap we could barely comprehend. We turned to run back to camp, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping. We didn't stop until we reached the lake. The moonlight illuminated our campsite, and the fire still flickered weakly. But when we arrived, we froze in horror. Our gear was scattered, the tent torn apart. In the center of the camp was a message carved into the ground with something dark and sticky. "Thanks for playing." Panic set in, and we grabbed what we could. We didn't speak, didn't look back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding. The last thing I saw was the cabin, standing silent and foreboding, the laughter echoing in my mind. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes I still hear the whispers, drawing me back to the woods. Camping had always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life. When my friends suggested a weekend trip to a remote site deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and drove until the city lights vanished behind us. The excitement buzzed in the air as we set up camp, and I felt an undeniable thrill at the prospect of sleeping under the stars. As night fell, the forest transformed. Shadows deepened, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air. We gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, the flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. But as the night wore on, a strange unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, My friend Jenna suggested we explore the woods a bit further. Feeling adventurous and slightly emboldened by the warmth of the fire, we agreed. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the darkness, the beam of light slicing through the thick air. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and every rustle made my heart race. As we walked deeper into the woods, a cold wind swept through the trees, chilling me to the bone. Then, from somewhere nearby, we heard it, a low, guttural sound. My stomach twisted into knots, and I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Jenna, ever the jokester, laughed it off and urged us to keep going. Despite my instinct screaming to turn back, I followed, curiosity overriding my fear. Then we saw it. A flickering light in the distance, just beyond a thicket of trees. It glowed like a beacon, and we instinctively moved toward it. As we approached, I felt a rising sense of dread. The light danced erratically, illuminating something that looked like figures standing in a clearing. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the sound of chains clanking filled the air, growing louder and closer. Panic surged through me, and we all froze. What were those figures? Were they real? Jenna whispered that we should hide, and we quickly ducked behind a large tree. Our hearts pounding, peering around the trunk, we saw the figures more clearly. They were cloaked in ragged white fabric, their faces obscured by masks that were painted to resemble anguished expressions. Each figure held a lantern, and the light glinted off the chains wrapped around their bodies. They moved slowly, almost like they were searching for something. The clinking of their chains echoed ominously through the stillness of the night. My pulse raced as fear gripped me. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Just then, one of the figures turned, and for a moment, our eyes locked. The mask hid its face, but I felt a chill run down my spine, as if it were staring directly into my soul. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I remained frozen, paralyzed by terror. The figures began to move again, continuing their slow march through the woods. As they faded into the distance, I finally found my voice. "We should get back to camp," I urged, my heart pounding in my ears. The others nodded, their faces pale, and we turned to make our way back. We stumbled through the darkness, adrenaline fueling our every step. As we broke through the trees and reached our campsite, relief washed over me. But that relief was short-lived. Our camp was in disarray. The tents were torn, and the fire had been doused. Panic gripped us again. What happened here? Jenna screamed when she spotted something on the ground. We rushed over, and my stomach dropped. There, scratched into the earth, were the words, "We will find you." The message was clear and chilling. We gathered what we could and raced to the car, each of us glancing over our shoulders as if expecting to see those figures emerge from the shadows. As we sped away, the forest receding behind us, I thought about the figures. They had looked so surreal, so dreamlike, yet the fear they inspired felt painfully real. I glanced back one last time, and for a split second, I thought I saw one of the masked figures standing at the edge of the trees, lantern glowing softly in the darkness, watching us leave. That image haunts me still, a terrifying reminder that some things in the woods are better left undisturbed. I never spoke of that night to anyone, afraid they might think I was losing my grip on reality. Sometimes, when I find myself alone at night, the memory of those chains clanking sends a chill through my bones, and I wonder if they ever really let us go. I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. Most nights are quiet, but there was one night that has haunted me ever since. It was mid-October, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of pine. I was on a routine patrol when the eerie stillness settled over the forest. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle and your heart race. Around 8 p.m., I got a call over the radio. A family camping nearby reported strange noises coming from the woods. The father described them as high-pitched screeches followed by low growls. Unlike anything they had ever heard, I felt a chill creep down my spine. I told them I would check it out, trying to keep my voice steady. As I hiked toward their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows deepened, swallowing the light from my flashlight. I could hear the wind rustling through the branches, but there was something else, a low thudding sound echoing in the distance. It felt unnatural, rhythmic, almost as if something was moving through the trees. When I finally reached the campsite, it was eerily quiet. The family's tent stood dark and still, the flickering light of their campfire casting long shadows on the ground. I called out to them, but received no reply. A knot formed in my stomach as I unzipped the tent. Inside, their belongings were scattered, but the family was gone. Their sleeping bags lay untouched, and I noticed a half-eaten bag of marshmallows abandoned by the fire. Then I heard it again, the thudding sound, now closer and more urgent. Panic surged through me. I stepped out of the tent, gripping my flashlight tightly. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to writhe, almost alive. I swept the light around, searching for any sign of the family. That's when I saw something moving between the trees. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, its shape distorted and unnatural. It looked humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head oddly shaped. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature turned its head toward me, revealing eyes that glowed like embers. I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat. The creature let out a shriek that pierced the night, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. I turned and ran, sprinting down the path, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear the thudding sound behind me, getting closer with each step. The adrenaline surged through me as I pushed myself harder. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst onto the main trail where I had parked my truck. I fumbled for the radio, breathless as I called for backup. I needed help. I needed to find that family. After what felt like an eternity, another ranger arrived. A flashlight in hand, we retraced my steps back to the campsite, but the creature was gone. I explained everything to my fellow ranger, and we searched the area thoroughly. The family was still missing. Just as we were about to give up, I noticed something unusual. A set of footprints leading away from the campsite. Deep imprints in the soft ground that looked far too large to belong to any human. I followed the prints, my heart racing again. They led deeper into the woods, away from the main trails. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above us. After several minutes of walking, we found ourselves in a small clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, with its trunk gnarled and twisted, and at the base of that tree lay the family's belongings: hiking boots, a backpack, and even a stuffed animal. But there was no sign of them. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a soft whimper. I turned to see the ranger beside me, his face pale and ashen. Then it happened. The ground beneath us shifted, and the massive tree creaked ominously. I stumbled back as I realized the truth. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a trap, a living thing. The roots twisted and curled, reaching out like fingers, searching for more. Suddenly, the tree shuddered violently, and I was knocked to the ground. The ranger shouted, but the sound was drowned out by a deafening roar that shook the earth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, never looking back. The next morning, the search teams found the family unharmed, wandering near the edge of the woods, unaware of what had transpired. They insisted they had only gone for a short walk and had become disoriented in the darkness. The ranger and I tried to explain, but no one believed us. They had returned unscathed, but I knew what lurked beneath the surface of those woods. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. We decided to go camping one late summer evening, a spontaneous trip to escape the city. It was just a couple of friends and me, eager to unwind under the stars. We arrived at a secluded area in the woods, far from the main trails, where the trees loomed tall and thick, creating a natural canopy. As night fell, we set up our tents and built a fire, the crackling warmth contrasting with the encroaching chill of the forest. After some time, as the stars began to flicker into view, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. Yena suggested a nighttime hike to explore the area. Matt and Aaron agreed, their eyes glinting with the excitement of adventure. I hesitated but eventually joined, feeling the thrill of the unknown pulling me along. Equipped with flashlights, we wandered deeper into the woods. The darkness enveloped us, the only sounds being our footsteps crunching on the twigs and leaves. The light from our flashlights danced erratically among the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to flicker and dart away as we moved. It was all fun and games until we stumbled upon a small clearing. The moonlight spilled into the space, illuminating what looked like an old, decrepit campsite. The remnants of a fire pit sat overgrown with weeds, and the scattered remains of a few broken chairs were half buried in the earth. Suddenly, we heard a faint rustling sound coming from the trees at the edge of the clearing. We all froze, straining to listen. It was followed by a soft, rhythmic clanking, like chains being dragged across the ground. My heart raced as I turned to my friends, their expressions mirroring my own fear. It felt as if the forest itself held its breath. Without speaking, we edged closer together, our flashlights illuminating the surrounding trees. Then, through the shadows, we saw them, figures shrouded in darkness, their forms obscured by the underbrush. They wore ragged clothing and seemed to move in unison, stepping into the clearing like they were part of the very shadows themselves. Each figure carried a lantern, the flickering light revealing glimpses of gaunt faces hidden behind tattered masks. They appeared almost ghostly, chained together, their movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged within us, and we ducked behind a tree, the bark rough against my back as I pressed into the wood. I could hear the clanking of chains growing louder as the figures approached, their lanterns swinging gently as if they were searching for something or someone. They moved closer to our hiding spot, the light from their lanterns illuminating the ground around us. My breath quickened, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. Then, just as one of them stopped, the lantern light shining directly on our tree, I stifled a gasp. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Then, as quickly as they had come, the figures turned and continued deeper into the woods. The sound of chains faded into the distance. We waited in silence, hearts pounding, unsure of what to do next. After several minutes, we finally dared to move, creeping back to our campsite, but what we found left us frozen in horror. Our tents were upturned, the fire pit was filled with embers, and the ground was marked with deep scratches, as if something had clawed at the earth. But the most chilling sight was the message scrawled in the dirt near our fire pit: "We will find you." I felt my stomach drop as dread settled in. We scrambled to gather our things, adrenaline propelling us forward. The forest felt alive, the trees watching as we hurriedly packed. The cool air turned frigid, and I could hear the rustling again, closer this time. In a frenzy, we piled into the car, the engine roaring to life as we drove away. We didn't stop until we were miles down the road, the forest fading into the distance. Later, we would tell ourselves it was just a trick of the mind, the wildness of the woods playing games with us. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint clinking of chains echoing in my memory. What still chills me the most is the thought that those figures might still be out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers, the lanterns glowing in the dark, and I wonder if they'll ever find us again. As a park ranger, I've learned to appreciate the serenity of the woods, but that serenity can quickly turn into dread. It was the first week of October when I received a call about a family camping deep in the woods. They'd set up their tent near a secluded lake, and the father reported strange sounds echoing through the trees, unnatural and unsettling. I assured him I would investigate and packed my gear, feeling a growing unease. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sun dipping lower and casting elongated shadows. The path twisted through dense foliage, each step echoing in the silence. The vibrant hues of autumn leaves were almost too beautiful to warrant concern. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I approached the campsite, the air thickened with tension. I spotted their tent nestled among the trees, but noticed something strange. The campsite was eerily quiet. I called out, but only the wind responded. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, pushing aside the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The first thing I noticed was a half-empty cooler, and my heart sank. It was as if they had just left, but something felt wrong. I stepped inside the tent, half expecting to see the family gathered around, but it was empty. Their sleeping bags were laid out, but personal items were strewn around as if they had been in a hurry. A flicker of movement caught my eye from outside. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I heard a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the edge of the forest. I followed the sound, my pulse racing. The trees thickened, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. As I approached, the thumping grew louder and seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath as I tightened my grip. The beam of light revealed a tall figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and its limbs appeared unnaturally long. I was paralyzed for a moment, and then it turned its head toward me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Before I could react, it vanished behind the trees, leaving only the echo of its thumping sound. Fear coursed through me, and I bolted back toward the campsite. I had to find the family and get them out of here. As I ran, the woods seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. When I reached the campsite, I quickly grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it crackled with static. The fear clawing at my throat deepened. Just then, I heard a scream piercing and desperate coming from the direction of the lake. I sprinted toward the sound, praying I wasn't too late. I emerged onto the lake shore, and there they were, the family huddled together, staring wide-eyed at something in the water. I followed their gaze, and my stomach dropped. The figure I had seen earlier was now standing knee-deep in the lake, water dripping from its elongated limbs, its face obscured by shadows. In an instant, it turned its head toward us, and I felt a jolt of terror as it took a step forward, moving as fluidly as a shadow. Just then, the family scrambled back, and I shouted at them to run. I grabbed the father's arm, urging him to get his family moving. We ran back through the trees, the fear propelling us forward. I led them to a clearing where we could see the distant glow of the park's visitor center. It felt safe, and the sound of the creature faded behind us. We reached the building, breathless and terrified, but when I turned to check on them, my heart sank. The family was gone, no footprints in the mud, no sign of their presence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had been talking to a family just moments before. I called out for them, panic flooding my senses. Then, I turned around, and there it was again, the creature. This time, it was standing right behind me, a chilling grin stretching across its face. I was frozen in place, but before I could scream, it whispered in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't have come here." And then it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone, surrounded by the dense woods, knowing that whatever had taken the family would not stop until it claimed me too. It started out as a typical camping trip with my closest friends. We had all been looking forward to this weekend for months: fresh air, good food, and nights spent telling ghost stories around the fire. There were 6 of us, a tight-knit group, heading out to a secluded spot deep in the woods. It was a place we had visited a few times before, always quiet and peaceful. This time, though, something felt off from the start. The sun had just begun to set when we arrived at our campsite. The trees were dense, the air thick with the smell of pine. We set up our tents and unpacked, laughing as we worked. But there was something unnerving about the silence that surrounded us. No birds, no insects, just a heavy, eerie quiet that made my skin prickle. That night, we built a fire. The flames flickered in the dim light, casting long, dancing shadows on the trees around us. We joked and told stories, but the air felt thick, like something was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the dark woods stretching out behind our campsite. Around midnight, as the fire began to die down, we heard a noise, something moving through the brush near the edge of our camp. It was faint at first, like footsteps, but quick and deliberate, too deliberate to be an animal. My heart started pounding, but I tried to shake it off. "Probably just a deer," I muttered, trying to sound confident, but the footsteps kept coming, closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I listened. It was too rhythmic, too precise to be an animal. The others heard it too, and they fell silent. We all turned to look at the edge of the trees where the sound was coming from. For a long, tense moment, nothing moved. Then, just as I was about to suggest we go investigate, a figure appeared at the edge of the FIRELIGHT. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. At first, I thought it was just a person, but as it stepped closer, I realized there was something wrong with it. Its skin was pale, almost sickly, and its face was completely blank. No expression, no features. It didn't move like a human, its body jerking unnaturally with each step. Panic surged through me. My friends were frozen, unable to speak, too terrified to even breathe. The figure didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at us. I thought I saw its mouth twitch, but I couldn't be sure. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness without a sound. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, none of us daring to speak. Finally, one of us stood up, voice trembling, saying we should pack up and leave. I agreed immediately, and we hastily gathered our things, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes watching us from the trees. We drove through the night, barely speaking, all of us on edge. but the feeling of unease never left. It wasn't until the next day, when we were back in the safety of our homes, that the real horror began. I was checking through the photos we had taken during the trip when I noticed something strange in one of the shots. It was a picture of our campsite, taken before the figure appeared. In the background, just at the edge of the firelight, there was a figure tall, thin, and just barely visible, blending into the shadows behind the trees. I had no memory of seeing it when the photo was taken. I showed the others, and they all gasped. They remembered the moment clearly. The figure wasn't there when we took the picture, but now it was. We couldn't stop thinking about it. We compared other photos from the trip, but none showed anything unusual. Just the one. The more we discussed it, the more unsettling it became. I decided to zoom in on the figure, and when I did, my stomach dropped. I could see it now, clearer than before. The shape wasn't just standing there, it was looking right at us. Its eyes were dark, empty holes, like someone had carved them out. That's when I realized the most terrifying thing of all. The figure we saw by the fire wasn't the same as the one in the photo. The one we had seen in the photo had been standing there the entire time watching us. The one by the fire had never moved. It was never real. We hadn't been looking at a person at all. We had been looking at a reflection of ourselves, and that figure was still out there. A few months ago, my friends and I decided to go on a weekend camping trip. We picked a remote spot deep in the woods, away from the usual crowded campsites. The idea was simple: get some fresh air, disconnect, and enjoy the quiet beauty of nature. But from the moment we arrived, something about the place felt off. The trees were thick, and the air was unnaturally still. No birds, no whine, just silence. We shrugged it off as a normal part of the wilderness and set up our tents. The forest around us seemed untouched, ancient even. The ground was soft, damp with moss, and the only sounds came from the occasional snap of a twig underfoot as we explored. That night, after we cooked our dinner, we gathered around the fire, telling stories and laughing. The fire crackled loudly, but beyond its reach, the darkness was impenetrable. It was unsettling. My friends noticed it too, but none of us wanted to admit it. After a few beers, we agreed to head to our tents to sleep. I was the last one to crawl into my tent, the sound of my zipper feeling too loud in the silence. The night was heavy. I lay there, trying to fall asleep, but the quiet gnawed at me. Then, faintly, I heard something, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on the forest floor. I froze. It was far too soft to be an animal. I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just trees and the distant glow of the fire. I told myself I was imagining things and zipped the tent back up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to every rustle, every sigh of the wind through the branches. Hours passed. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, closer this time. A distinct shuffle, followed by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. My heart pounded as I listened, trying to make sense of it. The whisper sounded like words, but I couldn't make them out. I lay there, terrified, holding my breath. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I could hear it clearly. "Get out," it said. I froze, barely daring to breathe. I thought maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke, but no one had moved, and the tents were eerily still. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined it into the night. Nothing, just the trees swaying, casting long shadows in the dim light. My heart raced as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I stepped out of the tent, my flashlight trembling in my hands, and called out to my friends. No answer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong, and I wasn't alone. I heard the shuffle again, followed by another whisper, but this time, it wasn't from the trees. It came from the direction of my friends' tents. Help? I immediately ran toward their tents, yelling their names. They quickly emerged, looking disoriented and confused. We gathered in a circle, nervously scanning the woods. That's when we heard it again, this time unmistakably close. Get out. We weren't sure what to do. So, we quickly packed up and decided to leave the area. But, as we gathered our things, we noticed something strange. In the dirt near the fire pit were tracks. Deep, heavy footprints much too large to belong to any of us. They led into the woods, right toward the area where we had been hearing the whispers. We stood there, paralyzed with fear. The tracks weren't just in one direction, they circled our campsite, as if something had been moving around us all night. One of my friends, desperate to make sense of it, grabbed his phone and checked the GPS, but when he tried to pull up the map, his phone screen flickered and went black. No signal, no connection. It was as if the forest was blocking us out, cutting us off from the outside world. Without saying another word, we grabbed our bags and hurried back toward the trailhead. As we moved, I couldn't help but feel eyes on us, the weight of the woods pressing in. The whispers didn't stop, they followed us, getting louder, more frantic. Finally, after what felt like hours of rushing through the woods, we made it to the road. We collapsed by the car, gasping for breath. The night was silent once again, as though nothing had ever happened. We drove away without looking back, and none of us spoke a word until we were well out of the woods. It wasn't until later, when we were looking through the photos from the trip, that we realized something that made my blood run cold. In one of the pictures, taken just before we packed up to leave, there was a face. It was faint, hidden in the trees behind us, staring directly at the camera. It had no eyes, just dark, hollow sockets. We didn't go back to those woods, and we never will, but the whispers haven't stopped. They're still there, sometimes when I'm alone, always saying the same thing: get out. I've seen a lot of strange things, animals behaving oddly, signs of storms that seemed to form out of nowhere, but nothing could prepare me for the night I had last spring. That night, I realized how much the forest hides from us. It all started as a routine patrol. The weather was turning cold, and I was assigned to a more isolated part of the park, an area where few people ventured. There was a small cabin near the trailhead, and my job was to check that everything was secure, ensuring no one had been up to mischief. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. As I made my way down the winding path, the trees were dense, blocking most of the fading daylight. The usual noises of the forest had quieted, which struck me as odd. It wasn't completely silent, but it felt like the woods were holding their breath. The birds, the wind, even the rustling of leaves had all faded. I reached the cabin just as night was beginning to fall. The air had turned chilly, and a dense fog began rolling in. I walked around the perimeter, checked the windows, and made sure the door was locked. The place felt abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I returned to the front of the cabin, ready to head back, when I heard a noise behind me, something subtle, but distinct. A faint scraping sound, as if something was dragging across the wooden floor inside the cabin. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My flashlight flickered as I tried to peer through the fog in the cabin's windows. There was no movement, but that sound continued, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I took a few cautious steps back toward the cabin door, considering my options. The scraping sound continued, now joined by a soft thumping. It was almost rhythmic, like footsteps. I had to check. I pulled out my keys and hesitated for just a second before unlocking the door. I swung it open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. The inside of the cabin was empty. No animals, no intruders, just dust and old furniture. But the scraping sound, it stopped the moment I stepped inside. I shined my flashlight across the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I noticed something strange. The floorboards, they were new, to new. I'd been in this cabin many times before, and the floor had always been worn, creaking underfoot. But now, the boards looked fresh, freshly laid, and unnaturally smooth. My heart started racing. I knelt down to examine the floor more closely, and that's when I saw a small, jagged crack at the edge of one of the boards. Something was behind it. I used my flashlight to peer into the crack and saw a flash of white. I leaned in closer, instinctively reaching out to touch the crack. That's when the scraping sound returned. It was louder this time, right behind me, coming from just inside the walls. I jerked around, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think, but every instinct screamed at me to run. The scraping didn't stop, and now there was a low, guttural breathing sound coming from within the walls of the cabin. One had to get out of there. I backed toward the door, fumbling for my keys. But before I could turn the handle, the breathing stopped. And then, something much worse happened. The floorboards beneath me creaked, but not in the usual way. It was as if something heavy was moving below the ground, crawling beneath the floor. I stepped back, my flashlight casting a trembling beam across the cabin. Then, with a sickening crack, the floorboard where I had been kneeling snapped upward. I jumped back, terrified, but nothing emerged from the hole. The scraping had stopped, and all I could hear was my own heavy breathing. I didn't wait another second. I rushed out of the cabin, slammed the door shut, and sprinted back down the trail, not stopping until I reached the ranger station. It wasn't until the next morning that I returned with a colleague to investigate the cabin. We pried up the floorboards, expecting to find the usual critters or perhaps an old forgotten stash of supplies. Instead, we found a hole beneath the floor, but no signs of any animals. What we did find were several old, decayed personal items, clothes, shoes, and a faded journal. It looked like someone had lived there once, but there was no record of any other park rangers ever having occupied the cabin. As I flipped through the journal, the last entry sent a cold chill through me. It's not just the trees that watch. Something else is out there, waiting for us to leave. We never spoke about that night again. I didn't believe in ghosts. I never had. That was, until the night I spent in the old farmhouse. It started as a dare, a stupid bet among friends. Spend one night in the place everyone whispered about, but no one dared to enter. They said the last family to live there had vanished. No one knew why or how. The house had sat empty for years, with broken windows staring out like blind eyes. I arrived just before sunset, armed with a flashlight, a fully charged phone, and a backpack stuffed with snacks and a blanket. The place looked worse up close, with ivy choking the sides and rot eating at the doorframe. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, and suffocating, carrying a faint metallic tang. Every creak of the floor under my boots echoed like gunfire in the silence. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I stayed in the living room, scrolling through my phone to distract myself. The furniture was old and mismatched, covered in a thick layer of dust. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its face cracked, hands frozen at 3 minutes past midnight. That should have unsettled me more than it did. At around 10 p.m., the noises began. It started subtly, a faint tapping, like fingers on glass, coming from the upstairs windows. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, though the trees outside were completely still. The tapping grew louder, then stopped. Just when I thought it was over, I heard something new. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy steps creaking across the wooden floor above me. My breath caught in my throat, and my flashlight trembled as I pointed it at the ceiling. The footsteps moved toward the staircase. I braced myself, expecting to see something horrifying emerge, but nothing appeared. The steps stopped abruptly, halfway down the stairs. I shone my light up the staircase, illuminating empty space. I told myself it was the house settling, that old wood creaked like that, but deep down, I knew better. Just after midnight, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. The air grew icy cold, and my breath puffed out in white clouds. I heard whispers, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. They came from the corners of the room, from the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. My heart pounded as I spun in circles, trying to find the source, but the whispers moved, always staying just out of reach. That's when I saw the painting. I hadn't noticed it earlier, but it hung above the fireplace, depicting a man, woman, and 2 children. The family stared out with unerringly blank expressions. I swore their eyes followed me as I moved. Then, the woman's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table, and my flashlight beam flickered. When the light steadied, the painting was just as it had been, the faces frozen in their original stoic expressions. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door, but the door wouldn't open. The knob turned, but it was like something was holding it shut. I heard laughter then, soft at first, then louder, echoing around me. It sounded like children, their giggles high-pitched and wrong, as though they came from tiny throats filled with static. The laughter stopped abruptly. I turned to find myself face to face with a woman from the painting. Her eyes were empty sockets, her smile stretched impossibly wide. revealing too many teeth. My scream caught in my throat as she raised a bony finger and pointed upstairs. I bolted to the window, smashing it open with a chair. Just as I climbed out, the whispers returned, growing louder, a cacophony of voices screaming at me to stop. I hit the ground running, not stopping until I reached my car. When I turned to look back, the house stood in eerie silence. I drove away, promising myself I'd never return. But as I sat in my room later that night, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I noticed something strange. The mirror was too dark, the reflection too slow. It wasn't me staring back anymore. I never believed in the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night. They were all just stories. But that weekend in the cabin changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway. A few friends and I rented an old cabin up in the woods, far from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just a few days to unwind. We arrived just before sunset, the cabin looking exactly like you'd expect from a secluded retreat, small, rustic, and surrounded by dense forest. That night, we gathered around the fireplace, sipping drinks and chatting. The place felt cozy, warm even. But as the evening went on, something felt off. The air grew heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every now and then, we heard faint knocks on the windows, but when we checked, there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the wind. But then, when we were heading to bed, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement was ajar. I could have sworn we'd closed it earlier. I mentioned it to the group, but they shrugged it off. We were all tired, and the subject was dropped. The night was quiet at first. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking at the door. I lay there frozen, listening. The knock stopped, but the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but it didn't stop the creeping dread in the pit of my stomach. Around 3 a.m., the tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent. Then came a low voice, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It whispered my name, "Let me in." I sat up in bed, heart racing. My mind raced to explain it away. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke. But when I looked around, everyone was sound asleep. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air in the room felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. The voice came again, louder this time, "Let me in." The door to my room creaked as if something was gently pushing against it. I wanted to scream, to wake up my friends, but I couldn't make a sound. It felt like whatever was outside could hear my every breath, my every movement. I didn't dare make a sound. The door suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and I froze. But there was nothing there, no person, no figure. Just the dark, empty hallway. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt my legs shake as I got out of bed. I crept toward the door, my every instinct telling me to run, but I had to know what was going on. I stepped into the hallway, and as I looked down at the basement door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The door was now wide open. I knew I had closed it earlier. There was no way it had been left open. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way down the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The basement was cold, unnaturally cold. I shone my light around, scanning the dark corners, the old shelves, the dusty floor. Then, in the farthest corner, I saw it, a mirror. Old, cracked, with a thick layer of dust covering it. But it wasn't the mirror that made my blood run cold, it was the reflection. I saw myself standing there, flashlight in hand, but the reflection wasn't quite right. My face was twisted, eyes hollow, grinning in a way I never would. It was like looking at a version of myself that wasn't human. I stepped back in shock, tripping over a box behind me. As I fell, I turned around to find the mirror was gone, vanished, just like that. I ran back upstairs, shaking with fear. When I reached the top of the stairs, the knocking on the door started again, louder, more frantic, and the voice whispering my name again, calling to me. Let me in. I didn't want to go near the door. I didn't want to even look at it, but somehow, I found myself at the door. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was no one there. Just empty air, the hallway stretching before me. But that's when I noticed at the mirror it was in the hallway now, standing in front of my bedroom door. And as I stared into the reflection, I realized with horror the twisted version of myself was still there, smiling back at me. My friends and I were excited for a weekend getaway. We rented a cabin in a remote area, far away from the noise and chaos of city life. None of us were really into anything spooky, and we thought it would be a peaceful escape. The cabin itself was old but charming, with wood-paneled walls and an inviting fireplace. We arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked, and decided to explore the surrounding woods. There were no trails, just thick, dense trees that seemed to go on forever. It was peaceful, almost a quiet. I felt like we were the only people on Earth, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. That evening, after dinner, we gathered around the fireplace and told stories. We laughed a lot, drank wine, and enjoyed each other's company. But as night fell, the wind picked up. It howled against the windows, and the old house creaked under the pressure. We joked about the house being haunted, but it was all in good fun until things took a turn. Around midnight, we heard something from the back of the cabin. It sounded like a door creaking, followed by heavy footsteps. At first, we thought it was just the house settling. But when the footsteps grew louder and closer, I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The others looked at me, their faces as confused as mine. But no one said anything. We waited, listening intently. The footsteps continued, slowly, deliberately. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was moving through the house. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's messing around?" I asked, trying to sound brave. No answer. I glanced around at my friends, but they looked just as scared as I felt. We all gathered near the hallway, straining to hear. The sound of footsteps was so close now that I could almost feel them vibrating through the floorboards. One of my friends, Ryan, slowly crept toward the hallway. He mustered the courage to call out, "Hello. Who's there?" No response. The silence after that was deafening. Then, suddenly, the floorboards creaked loudly from the other side of the room, followed by a sharp knock on the wall. We all jumped. "Okay, that's it. Let's get out of here," said Sarah, her voice shaky, but we couldn't leave. The wind had picked up so strongly outside that the front door was now jammed shut. The knocking from the other side of the room persisted, growing louder, like someone was trying to get in. We huddled together in the living room, terrified. We thought about calling the police, but none of us had a signal on our phones. The atmosphere was thick with dread. Then, the lights flickered, and the knocking stopped. A cold breeze swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. I looked toward the front door. It was slightly ajar. I swear it hadn't been when we had last checked. We moved as a group, cautiously toward the door. Ryan tried to close it, but the handle wouldn't turn. He pulled harder. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut with a violent bang. We screamed, and then, the voice came soft at first, but growing louder. "Let me in," it whispered. We all froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside the door, though. It was coming from inside the cabin. The voice seemed to echo through the walls, reverberating all around us. I was about to turn and run when I noticed something strange. The air near the fireplace seemed to shimmer. At first, I thought it was the heat from the flames, but then I saw an outline, like a figure standing in the doorway. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Everyone nodded, their faces pale and wide-eyed. We had to leave. But how? I ran toward the back door, desperate to find a way out, but as soon as I opened it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark figure was standing in the yard, just beyond the threshold, watching us. I slammed the door shut and turned to my friends. We were trapped, and that's when the whispering started again, louder, clearer. "Let me in." It was the same voice as before, but now it sounded closer, as if it was right behind me. We all bolted for the front door, desperate to escape. When we opened it, the wind howled, and we ran out into the woods without looking back. We made it to our car, heartbeats racing. As we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, just watching us leave. I'll never forget that feeling of being watched. We made it out, but that place wasn't empty. Something had been there with us the entire time. something that was still waiting for us to return, and I don't think it will ever stop. We started our hike early, the sun just beginning to climb above the horizon, painting everything in soft hues of pink and gold. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the kind of crisp air that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, and we made good time. The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges sharp against the sky. By noon, we reached the highest point. We stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. Below, the ocean stretched out endlessly, its deep blue surface dotted with white caps. The rocks beneath our feet were slippery, but we were careful. There was no real danger. Just awe at how wild and beautiful the world could be. We ate lunch on the cliffs, chatting about everything and nothing, when the first odd thing happened. At the far end of the cliff, just out of sight from where we were sitting, there was a figure. It wasn't someone from our group. This person was standing motionless, facing the ocean, a dark silhouette against the light. I squinted, trying to make out details, but they were too far away. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. Probably someone else out here, Mark said. Lots of people hike this spot, but it felt strange. The figure didn't move, not even to adjust their posture, just standing still, unmoving. I turned away, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It wasn't until we finished eating and packed up to leave that the figure became more troubling. We hadn't seen them leave, and the spot they were standing in was still empty. But the odd thing was, we now found fresh footprints in the dirt, footprints that led directly to the cliff's edge. I could tell they were recent, still deep and dark in the dirt, like someone had been standing right there only moments before. We followed the trail, but it led nowhere. The cliffs dropped sharply into the ocean below, with nothing but jagged rocks and a vast emptiness stretching out. There was no way the person could have just walked off the edge. It didn't make sense. I didn't say anything at the time, but the unease was growing in me. There was something wrong here. The longer I looked at the prints, the more unsettled I became. They didn't seem like the footprints of someone who had been hiking. They were too deliberate, too precise, like they had been placed there for a reason. I tried to push it out of my mind, but as we began heading back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. My skin prickled with an invisible tension. We continued, laughing and talking, but I kept looking over my shoulder. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, we began to make our way back toward the parking area. That's when I saw it again, the same figure. This time, they were not far from us, standing in the shadow of a large rock. Their back was to us, but I could see something clearly. They were holding something in their hands, something I couldn't identify, but it was too big and too unnatural to ignore. I stopped walking, and my friends turned to look at me. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "There's someone over there," I said, pointing. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The space was empty. "Stop messing with us," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "There's no one there," but I was sure. I'd seen it clearly. My heart began to race. I wanted to leave, to get back to the car and drive far away from this place, but something made me stop. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. We reached the parking area just as the sun was setting. It was a small, gravel lot with a single path leading to the main road. As we neared the cars, I heard a sound, a low, grating noise, like something scraping against stone. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind us except the dense trees and the empty, silent cliff. But then, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. The voice was saying my name. I froze. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a voice I didn't recognize, soft but clear, as if it had been waiting for me to hear it. "Don't leave." I snapped around to face my friends, but they were already piling into the cars, unaware of the chill that had run down my spine. I didn't tell them what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just wanted to get out of there. We left the cliffs, the strange voice still echoing in my mind. The car ride back was quiet, everyone too exhausted to talk. But when I got home later, that night, I noticed something on my phone, a new notification, a picture. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, standing on the edge of the cliffs. But I was alone in the photo. The figure was nowhere to be seen. And then, I noticed something chilling in the background. There was someone else in the shadows, just out of view, watching me from a distance. The first time I saw the old man, I thought he was just a local, wandering through the market like everyone else. It was late afternoon, the sun a lazy disk in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and shadow. I was at the open-air market, the kind with vendors yelling about their wares, hawking everything from fresh fruit to handmade jewelry. I always loved coming here. It was a small escape from the monotony of my life. He was standing by the flower stall, head bent, as if examining the petals. He was tall and thin, with a face creased into a labyrinth of wrinkles, eyes clouded and pale. When I caught him staring, I looked away quickly, my skin crawling. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just an old man, lonely and curious. I didn't see him again until later, that evening when I was walking home, weaving through the narrow, cobbled streets. The sky had darkened, and the street lamps cast long, flickering pools of light across the pavement. As I passed an abandoned building, I heard the sound of shuffling feet behind me. I turned, and there he was, his pale eyes fixed on me, hands shaking at his sides. "Are you following me?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. He stopped, tilted his head, and said something so low I couldn't make out the words, but the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine, as if he knew something I didn't. I quickened my pace, heart thundering in my chest. The sound of his footsteps echoed after me until I reached the safety of the busy street where people still lingered, chatting and laughing. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but he had vanished. The next day, I woke up to a strange feeling, the air in my room heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of feeling that makes you check the locks on your doors, make sure every window is secure. I told myself it was just paranoia, but when I pulled open the curtains, my heart almost stopped. There, in the alleyway just across from my apartment, the old man stood. He stared, unmoving, his eyes wide and hollow. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he raised a hand and pointed directly at me. A rush of icy dread shot through me. I slammed the window shut, the thud shaking the walls. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I stayed home, peeking through the blinds, waiting for him to reappear. Hours passed, the light shifting from morning to afternoon, but he didn't come back. Just as I let out a shaky breath, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, frozen, and then a voice called out, "Hello. Miss. Are you okay? It's the building manager. We've had reports of strange activity." I opened the door a crack, heart hammering. He stood there in a neat, gray uniform, eyes kind but curious. I nodded, mutely, and he continued, "We've been getting complaints about someone lurking in the alley. Any idea who it might be?" I tried to speak, but couldn't. Finally, I managed to say, "An old man. He's been watching me." The manager raised an eyebrow. "There's no one out there now, but we've had similar reports for weeks. People say he appears and disappears like a shadow, never coming any closer." My blood ran cold. "Do you know who he is?" The manager shook his head. "He's been around for years. People say he's a ghost, or something worse. But he only appears to those who need to see him. Stay inside tonight, miss." I thanked him, my voice trembling, and shut the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards, had me on edge. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a faint tapping at the window. Light as a feather, I couldn't help myself. I pulled the curtains aside, and there he was, standing in the dark, one hand pressed to the glass as if trying to push through. Before I could scream, he whispered in a voice barely audible, "You're not safe." The glass fogged up with his breath, and a shape appeared, a face. My own face, but older, withered and cracked, eyes hollow and dark. I stumbled back, gasping. He vanished into the night, leaving only the chill and the echo of those words. It's been years now, and I've never seen him again. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right or when the street lamps flicker in the dark, I swear I feel that cold, hollow stare, waiting, watching, and I know he's still out there, looking for the next one to hear his warning. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as I walked down the old, gravel path that led to my grandparents' farm. I loved the place, the wide, open fields, the way the wind whispered through the tall grass, But tonight, there was something different about it. The air felt heavy, and the usual chorus of crickets and birds was eerily silent. I was here to help Grandma prepare for the harvest festival. She had always said that there was a special kind of magic in the soil, and she swore that the night before the festival was when it was strongest. I chuckled at that, but I loved the traditions and stories that surrounded the farm, so I kept an open mind. The old barn loomed ahead, its wood weathered and cracked. The last rays of sunlight caught on its flaking paint, casting long, dark shadows. I pushed open the heavy door, and the smell of dry hay and aged wood filled my nose. I made my way to the back, where Grandma was pulling old lanterns from a shelf. "Come to help, darling," she called out, her voice warm and welcoming. I nodded, and she handed me a lantern with a smile. "This is for you. The light will guide you. But be careful when the dark comes. It can be tricky." I was about to laugh when the barn door creaked open behind me, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned to see a figure standing just outside, silhouetted by the fading light. It was tall, too tall, with long arms that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Grandma's expression shifted. She stood up slowly, eyes narrowing. "You're not supposed to see them, but if they want you to, then it's too late." "What do you mean?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my arm and led me out of the barn, her grip surprisingly strong for her age. The sky had darkened, and the first star shone bright, almost like an omen. "It's time for the old stories," Grandma said, her voice low. "The things that come out tonight are older than the land. They want to play. They want to know if you're brave enough to face them." I laughed nervously, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy silence. As we stood in the open field, the wind picked up, carrying with it a low hum that felt almost like a distant, mournful song. Then I heard the soft padding of feet, like someone walking in the tall grass. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and closer than it should have been. I gripped the lantern tighter, the flame flickering wildly as I searched the dark. "Grandma, what's out there?" My voice cracked with fear. "They're just shadows," she said, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. "But they don't like it when you shine light on them." Before I could ask what she meant, a form emerged from the darkness, human in shape, but its limbs bent at odd angles, its face obscured by a veil of black that moved like a living curtain. My blood ran cold, and I took a step back, the lantern nearly slipping from my fingers. "Do you see me?" The figure whispered, its voice like the rustle of dry leaves. It raised an arm, one that stretched and bent until it touched the ground, and then it tilted its head. 1,000 eyes seemed to open in its shadowy veil, blinking and staring, each one colder than the last. I couldn't move. My heart thudded so hard I thought it would burst. Grandma reached out and put her hand on my arm. Her touch was the only warmth I felt as the figure took a step closer. "Look away," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't let them in." But it was too late. I looked, and for a second, I saw my own reflection in one of those cold, blinking eyes. And then, the figure stepped back, vanishing into the dark as if it had never been there. The silence returned, but it was not the same. It was heavy, alive, and watching. Grandma squeezed my arm and nodded solemnly. "They will remember you now. Be careful. The dark always comes back for those who have seen it." I didn't sleep that night. And every night since then, I hear that faint, shuffling step in the distance, the same as before, and the whisper, "Do you see me?" I know now that I can never truly escape it, not when the dark is always waiting, just beyond the reach of my lantern's light.